Hey friends, welcome to another reading vlog, and I'm really excited about this one because I'm on the hunt for a new favorite fantasy read. And I know I just shared my favorite fantasy books of all time. Check that out if you missed it. But I also asked you for your favorite fantasy books in the comments, and y'all left some recommendations for books that sound so up my alley. And I feel like y'all know my taste really well at this point, and seeing your recommendations in the comments, seeing you rave about your favorites and bring up books that I have heard rumblings about in the bookish community just made me really want to find even more amazing books that I can add to my favorites list, like a dragon hoarding all the treasure. I have 5 books for this video. So first off, we have To Shape a Dragon's Breath. A young Indigenous woman enters a colonizer-run dragon academy and quickly finds herself at odds with the approved way of doing things in the first book of a brilliant new fantasy series. I love dragons. That's something to know about me. And I also love Indigenous literature in a variety of genres. So I am very excited about this one. I have heard people raving about this. I have heard so many people say this is their new favorite fantasy read of all time. I'm very excited for an Indigenous take on dragons. Next is another one that I have heard people raving about, so many of my favorite booktubers raving about, The Spear Cuts Through Water. I am very excited that someone mentioned it in the comments so I could add it to this video because it was on my TBR already. I was trying to find a reason to prioritize it, and this is the reason. So this one is described as 2 warriors shepherd an ancient god across a broken land to end the tyrannical reign of a royal family in the standalone epic fantasy from the author of The Vanished Birds. Standalone, I didn't even realize. Love that. I love a standalone. There's nothing wrong with series. I'm just really bad at keeping up with them, so I appreciate a standalone. And I feel like fantasy has a dearth of standalones, you know? And I also love a good teardown of tyranny in my fantasy, you know, just a little casual destruction of the monarchy. I'm always a fan. Next one is kind of a controversial pick, and I'm so grateful that one of you suggested this and mentioned it as one of your favorites, because I feel like the more I hear about this book, the more intrigued I get, and at this point, I just have to read it for myself and see what I think, because people seem to either love this book or absolutely despise it with their entire being. When the Moon Hatched. I also did not realize when I ordered this that this is a tome. Oh my God, this comes in at just under 700 pages. I'm a little afraid, again, because everything I've heard about this book is so wildly polarizing, with people listing it as the worst book they've literally ever read in their life or their new favorite of all time. And there seems to be very little in between. So I am so intrigued by this. And this one also has dragons, which we have already established I am a fan of. So this one is described as a fast-paced fantasy romance featuring an immersive, vibrant world with mysterious creatures, a unique magic system, and a love that blazes through the ages. Now, the fact that it's romantasy also makes me a bit nervous because I haven't had the best experience with romantasy. I have read some books that are generally classified as romantasy that I have liked, but a lot of the really common romantasy tropes are really not to my taste. My impression is that a lot of people who love romantasy didn't like this because they felt it was too dense and the writing was too lyrical and there was too much detail, and all of those things sound more like what you might expect from a non-romantasy fantasy, so more of an epic fantasy. So maybe I'll like all of that stuff, but I am a bit nervous about what kind of romance tropes it will have, and if it's a huge age, height, and size gap shadow daddy kind of vibe, that's gonna be not my favorite thing ever. So anyway, this one is definitely the controversial pick of the video. I've probably seen more negative reviews than positive, but again, the positive reviews I've seen are people raving and saying it's their new favorite. So I'm intrigued. And one of you said it was your favorite, so I'm taking your suggestion. Then, The Will of the Many. Don't think I've seen anything lower than a 4-star rating of this. This one is described as a young fugitive uncovering layered mysteries and world-changing secrets at an elite academy. So maybe some dark academia vibes along with the fantasy. Intriguing. Again, this one has just been universally loved from what I've seen, and one of you was kind enough to list it as your favorite, so yoinked that right out of the comments and into this video. And now the final book I'm reading for this video, I'm kind of cheating because none of you listed it in the comments as your favorite, but like I said, I have seen this listed as so many people's new favorite fantasy read of all time, apparently universally loved and sounds incredible. So I am adding it into this video, and that is Blood Over Brighthaven. This book is making the rounds and so many people are raving. And again, it's one of those books that after hearing it raved about the first time, I added it to my TBR. And when I heard it raved about the 5th time, I immediately bought it. This one is described as the first woman ever admitted to a prestigious order of mages unravels a secret conspiracy that could change the practice of magic forever in this standalone dark fantasy. Another standalone! Everyone says this is amazing, and I'm very excited. So again, hopefully with these 5 books, I will find at least one that I can add to my top 10 favorites list, but I'm really hoping I at least get one 5-star read out of these because again, all I am hearing is raving and love. I'm actually gonna start with To Shape a Dragon's Breath. This is just the one that's pulling at me the most right now. I'm really intrigued to start. I'm excited about the dragons, okay? I want some good dragons. I'm feeling some FOMO because I DNF'd the 4th Wing series and everyone is talking about dragons and Onyx Storm right now. I want my own dragons, okay? So I'm gonna go start To Shape a Dragon's Breath. I'm really excited about this, and I'll be back when I get to the halfway point to give you my initial thoughts. Wish me luck. I really wanna find a new favorite. So I have reached the halfway point of To Shape a Dragon's Breath. Lots of tabs, lots of thoughts, and I'm excited to talk to you about them. It took me a little bit of time to get into the groove of things with this book. I think it's a combination of the main character being quite young, she's 15 at the start of the book, and the writing style. Not that I dislike it or that it's particularly strange, it just took me a minute to kind of lock in or acclimatize to the structure and the flow of the sentences, which is not really that uncommon, especially from book to book. If they have significantly different writing styles, I sometimes need a second to kind of shift my brain into the right headspace to take it in. But once I acclimatized to it, I started really enjoying the story. It does have more simple prose generally, but has had some really piercing quotes. I don't know if I would say anything is particularly lyrically described or anything. It's pretty straightforward, but there have been quotes that made me stop reading and say, damn, and have to use my quotes tab. So the book kicks off with our protagonist, Anacus, who is 15 at the start of the novel, and she sees a dragon, and dragons haven't been seen on her island in a very long time. So when she goes back home and tells her family about it, they advise that she should go back out to where she saw the dragon and do a small ritual to show her respect to the dragon, essentially. And when she does return to where she saw the dragon, she finds that there is an egg, though she takes it and brings it back to her village to be kept safe and warm. And eventually, when the egg hatches, the little baby dragon toddles over to Anacus and chooses her to be their human. And in her culture, in her language, they call this specific type of dragon an Empeshwe. And she becomes an Empesheweasit, which is, the human companion of a dragon, or a dragon rider, as the English would say, a dragoneer, but the person who is bonded with a dragon and is the one who will ride them and have that connection with them. And also potentially, if they develop their skills enough, they will be able to shape the dragon's breath. And a dragon's breath is their power, their magic, their ability to essentially take any object or element and break it into its composite parts and rebuild it into any other element or structure using those, building blocks. And so the idea is that the dragon and their human work closely together to utilize the dragon's magic. And Anacus is sort of overwhelmed and surprised by this turn of events, but also feels that it's very semi-natural and like they already have a connection. And so she heads to the mainland with the help of her older brother to study at an academy specifically for dragoneers to learn all of the different math and science that they need to develop the skills necessary to shape their dragon's breaths and to become a skilled dragon rider so that she can fulfill her destiny as a Nempeshueasit, as the first Nempeshueasit in a very long time, and harness the power of her new dragon, Kasakwa, to help her people. The themes here are largely dealing with the colonization of the indigenous peoples and the wars waged and genocides committed to claim their land and resources. And Anakus is trying to acclimatize to a very different environment, being completely surrounded by the settlers and colonizers of her land who feel that they are the civilized people and that she and her people are uncivilized, or many other much more offensive ways to say that. There's a lot of racism, there is a lot of classism and misogyny. Her people on Masquapog appear to have more of a matriarchal system, or at least their homes and land is passed down through the matriarchal line. But the colonizers have a patriarchal system and it is very misogynistic. There are very few female dragoneers. Feels very Victorian in its gender values, I guess. You know, there's a lot of emphasis on being a proper lady and, you know, always having a chaperone. And she's dealing with a lot of racism, both very overt and more microaggressive. She is sort of reckoning with the effects of colonization and trying to adjust to this new culture because she so desperately wants to learn what she needs to know so she can be the best Nempeshueasit that she can be for Kasakwa and for her people. And she's very invested in that journey despite all this newness and being alone in a strange land, essentially, and constantly having to deal with other people's disgusting prejudices. And I'm really enjoying this. Not only do I really like the world building, and I'm really loving the dragons, and there's so many different types of dragons, and hearing how they're described and their different behaviors. Kasakwa, in particular, Anakus's dragon, is a baby still, but she basically acts like a cat, and it's very cute. And her interactions with some of the other young dragons of Anakus's classmates, like Copper and Magnus, are very cute. I also just find that there's so many other sort of peripheral, interesting things being brought in. You know, there's, you know, propaganda in newspapers being used to rile up false outrage, to try to keep people in their place. There's also an element that the humans who are sort of bonded with these dragons, their emotions impact the dragons, and before the dragons have learned to control their breath and the dragon riders have learned how to shape it, it's very dangerous for the dragons to let loose their breath because it has so much potential energy. And Anakus witnessed this once with Kasakwa when she was very young, and so it's imperative to keep calm as much as possible, especially because in English society they are very strict about dragons letting loose their breath and risking anyone's safety, and will put dragons down if that happens. So Anakus is very concerned about that, obviously, because Kasakwa is incredibly young, but also because she's in the situation where people are constantly being so deeply racist and misogynistic and gross to her and bullying her, being lewd with her, harassing her, and she has to keep a calm head because she can't let Kasakwa let loose her breath because that would risk her life. And it's so enraging because other people can be absolutely cruel and horrible to her, and she has to be, you know, above it all. She has to stay calm. And it just makes me think of experiences I have heard from women of color of this necessity to be more calm than your white counterparts because any little raised emotion, any bit of passion is interpreted as aggression and violence and danger to such a wild degree that it becomes, you know, an unsafe situation. And it's so enraging. I feel like the author is doing such a good job of really portraying the frustration of that, of having other people be able and allowed to express themselves however they want, but for you to have to always be the calm one who's above it all. It is so frustrating to read, and I think that's exactly how it should feel to read about those experiences. So I'm really liking this. I like Anakus herself. I think she's a really interesting character. I would love to get to know more about her. I do think the first half has been very heavily focused on world building and history and starting to build up some of the foundations for the themes that are being explored, and also trying to give us sort of a base understanding of the magic system / the science involved and the technology of this world, which is pretty intricate and detailed, which I don't mind. I do find it interesting. A lot of it is going over my head, but that's okay. I don't actually have to be able to, shape a dragon's breath at the end of this. I'm not going to be going through exams, so it's fine. But definitely the first half has been more focused on that than character development, I would say. And while we are getting to know Anakus better, we are getting to know, some of her classmates better, and she's making some connections. I would love to see even more of that in the second half. I imagine we will, because now we have a lot of those bases covered to understand the world and what's happening. There's also a little bit of romance brewing. It appears that she has a crush on 2 different people at her school, one of which I immediately suspected would be a love interest as soon as they were introduced. And the other one, I was very pleasantly surprised to be brought in as a potential love interest. It seems like Anakus might be bisexual, and I love that. Love a little bit of queer rep in all the books I read, honestly, and love bisexual rep specifically as someone who is bisexual myself. Always lovely to read. I know who I'm rooting for out of the 2 of them. I will tell you in the spoiler section, but I'll leave that out of the general update for anyone who's thinking of picking this up. But yeah, I'm really excited to see how this develops. I think I have an idea of how this could go and how it could go wrong, but I'm hoping for the best. I'm rooting for Anakus and Kasakwa. I'm really excited to see how Kasakwa is going to grow. I do wonder if we're going to have a time jump, because Kasakwa is such a young, tiny little baby dragon that it feels like, she needs to grow a little bit more for some of the things I feel like the book is building up to happen, I am excited for more character development and for things to kind of ramp up in the plot department, but everything has been great so far. I'm having a good time, so I'm excited to go finish this. I will do a really quick spoiler section just to talk about the romance, I think, because I think I kind of covered everything else already, and I don't know that I need to go into more specific detail. But I do want to very quickly talk about the love interests. So I'll do that now. I'm going to do a really short spoiler section for the first half of To Shape a Dragon's Breath. Spoilers for the first half of To Shape a Dragon's Breath. This is the time to skip if you want to skip. Use the chapters in the description box, or mute me and wait until the frame around me disappears. Okay, so spoilers. Anakus first shows interest in a maid at the academy named Liberty, who is a girl. And I loved that sort of first realization for her that she was attracted to Liberty, because when she first sees Liberty, she does have a thought about how beautiful she is. And as the author describes what Liberty looks like, we're having that sort of internal monologue for Anakus that she thinks that this girl is so beautiful. We don't necessarily know, if there's any other subtext to that until later on, when Liberty offers to help Anakus get more appropriate clothing for some of the situations she's going to be in, and offers to measure her. And as she's taking her measurements, Anakus realizes how intimate of an experience it is to have someone up close and personal measuring all the different parts of your body. It makes me think of that one scene in Silo, if you've watched the Silo TV show. Liberty is measuring her, and they both sort of start to get short of breath and sort of shy around each other, and Anakus realizes that she really wants to kiss her, and I was just sitting there going, oh my God. Amazing, because I thought for sure that she was going to have a crush on the only other Indigenous student at the school, Theode, who she does end up having a crush on, so I was right about that. But I thought that they were going to be paired up, because they were the 2 outsiders, essentially. And while I think that makes sense, it also felt a little bit too obvious or too easy, I guess. I like that there's at least a little bit more interest, that she's not automatically just being paired off with the only other Indigenous person here, especially because as much as Theode is also an outsider because of his background, he didn't grow up amongst his people the way that she did, so he's very disconnected from his culture. So they don't actually have very much in common. He wasn't raised in the same way. He was raised amongst the Englishmen, and he was trained to be a servant. So there's another element there of how he is sort of separate from the rest of the student body, and he wasn't meant to be paired with the dragon. It just sort of happened. And as soon as he was introduced, as soon as it was mentioned, before she even got to the school, that there was another Indigenous student there, I thought, oh, okay, you know, they're going to end up together. I feel like that's what's going to happen. And then I was so excited when she had a crush on Liberty. I was like, oh, maybe I was wrong. Maybe she's a lesbian. And, you know, we're going to have a sapphic romance and it's going to be great. But then she also started getting, you know, tingly and flushed around Theod and wanted to kiss him after they danced a waltz. And I'm just not as enthusiastic about them, to be honest. You know, not that there's anything wrong with him necessarily. I just don't feel like he has that much going for him. Like, he was very rude to Anacus when she first arrived, and he did apologize, but he's just sort of bland so far. I find Sander much more interesting than Theod. He is sort of in their group of friends. I'll have to look it up to see if the author said anything about Sander's character, but he seems autistic coded to me. But I feel like he's a much more interesting character. He's much more endearing so far. I feel like we've seen way more of his personality, and we've also seen him and Anacus interact a lot more and in a lot more varied ways, and they seem to have way more in common and to just enjoy each other's company and understand each other better than she does with Theod. Nothing wrong with Theod necessarily, and maybe in the second half we'll get more development for him and I'll see the vision. But so far I feel like she's way better off with Liberty. We've seen more of their interactions as well. They seem to have more chemistry, but also just a very nice camaraderie going on that she doesn't really seem to have with Theod. So anyways, I'm rooting for Liberty. Surprise, surprise. I'm always rooting for the sapphic relationship, but I am pleasantly surprised that she is bisexual and that is part of the story so far. But that is it for the first half of To Shape a Dragon's Breath, and those are all my spoilery thoughts. So I'm going to go read the second half of this, and when I'm done, I'll be back to share all my final thoughts. Hello, I have just finished To Shape a Dragon's Breath. I have many thoughts, as you might be able to tell from the sheer number of tabs that I have used while reading. Before I get into the review though, I have to mark the book red on Fable. I feel like some of you will get it. One of the most satisfying parts of finishing a book for me is being able to mark it red in my various trackers. So let me mark this book red on Fable. And while I do that, I want to talk to you about Fable a little bit because they are the sponsor of today's video. Fable is an all-in-one platform to track your reading, build a reading habit, and connect with the bookish community to make friends and share recommendations, carving out your own little space within the bookish community to talk passionately about the books you love. With around 2 million readers across the globe and over 70,000 book clubs, Fable is an amazing place to find new bookish friends and make your own community. Fable has so much to offer, but my favorite thing about using Fable is tracking my reading, because not only do they make tracking your reading fun to the point where I want to open the app and track my reading every single day so I can keep my reading streak going, but they also present all of your stats in a really beautiful, really fun visual way. They're really aesthetically pleasing, but they also let me choose from a few different color palettes, and I appreciate that as someone who wants to make my digital life just as green as my real life. You can set your reading goal. So my goal for 2025 is 125 books, and I'm at a very satisfying 25 out of 125. You can also see your reading streak. So my best streak so far this year is 18 days straight of reading, which is not too bad. I'm also really enjoying the new reader summary beta. So my current reader summary is Emotional Explorer, which feels very apt. Mixing historical fantasy, contemporary struggles, and the depth of human emotion, your bookshelf is never dull. Your literary adventures inspire you to make real change in our world, which feels perfect for me. I really love that. I also really love the way they present how many books you finished each month. I love the graph with the book covers in there. It's just a really great at-a-glance view of how your reading is fluctuating from month to month. I also love looking at the reading streak calendar. That visual inspiration of seeing the streak lit up nice and bright and that motivation to keep the streak going as long as possible is so helpful, especially if you're someone who struggles with reading slumps. Give you that extra motivation to check in and read every day, even if you're only reading for 5 minutes or reading a single page, that counts. And that keeps you in the mindset of picking up your books and reading and making a little bit of progress every single day, which is super helpful. They also break down your most read genres. And I find it funny that this year, my most read genre so far is romance and also young adult, because I read all 5 of the Heartstopper volumes. This is definitely not usual for me, but considering I loved all of Heartstopper and it made my heart grow 15 sizes, I don't mind. If you're already using something to track your reading like Goodreads, you can use Fable's import feature to quickly bring over all your books from Goodreads into Fable. It's super easy, it's super fast. I think I have easily over 1,000 books in my Goodreads, and they all showed up in Fable within 3 to 4 minutes. I also love that using and supporting Fable is supporting a small independently owned business. Fable is independently owned by an incredible female Indian American founder and is run by a small dedicated team who love books. And so they're constantly rolling out new updates to make your experience better every single week. So if you haven't used Fable yet, what are you waiting for? Click the link in my description box to download the app. It's absolutely 100% free to use, and it's so much fun. Okay, so thoughts on this entire book. I will come right out and say off the bat, I really enjoyed this. I'm sort of hearing mixed things about whether this is classified as adult or young adult. I've tried searching it and I'm coming up with different answers from different sources. So I'm just gonna say that from my own perspective as a reader in my 30s, this reads like YA to me. The main character is 15 for a start, but also just the style, it does feel very YA. And I don't say that as an insult or something. That's not a bad thing. It just is a thing. It just exists. It's very neutral in my brain. This is a book that feels like it's written for teens and about teens, which is great and amazing. I just happen to not be a teen, so I want to put that out there right from the start, because I do think some of the things that maybe weren't perfect for me, I think are pretty easily explained by this being a book that is written about and for teenagers. I'm not necessarily the target demographic. So just putting that out there right away, but I did really, really like this. And this book as a whole thematically is really exploring the impact of colonization and the violence, the racism, the cultural destruction, and the forced assimilation, and the rippling negative impacts that that has. And it also sort of dives into propaganda and fear-mongering, trying to rile up the average person against the oppressed group as if they are somehow the aggressors and need to be held down. It's a very controlling and violent society, and Anna-Kus is sort of having her first experience of interacting with the colonizers because she has had sort of this more sheltered experience living on Masquapag where they really don't have any external influence. She's trying to kind of figure out her place in the society as someone who doesn't really want to belong to it. You know, she's not trying to assimilate. She's not trying to fit into their idea of what a proper lady should be. She is herself, and she is totally happy with her culture and her life on her island. She wants to go back to Masquapag. She feels like so many of the cultural differences that she's being faced with while at the academy are completely ridiculous. Really strict rules around how women and men can interact, and a complete lack of acceptance of anyone who is not straight or monogamous. And she just kind of looks at it in bafflement, because in her culture, it is totally fine to be queer in whatever way. Polyamory is very common and is not looked down upon and is just part of day-to-day life. And so she's just constantly facing these really odd cultural differences and just all of these really strict rules, and the fear and the anger and the distrust of anything different or unique. And she just can't really understand why they would choose to live that way, which, I mean, also, yes, I agree. Why? One of my favorite things about Anna-Kus as a protagonist is that despite being only 15, she is so sure of who she is. This isn't really a coming of age story. She's already come of age. You know, within her culture, she is seen as a woman. She isn't seen as a child, but also she just knows who she is, and she believes in her people, and she respects her culture and her way of life, and she loves her family and her community, and she isn't swayed by the colonizers and their community. She has a couple moments moments of enjoying aspects of their society or liking a dress that was made for her and thinking it's pretty, but she always has this sense of this isn't quite me. And I really appreciate that she isn't trying to assimilate or having doubts about where she belongs or whether, they're actually right, that their society is somehow better and more civilized. She is never questioning that. And she is constantly standing up for herself and for her people and for other people. And I really love that. She's a very strong person and very strong in her convictions and her beliefs and very confident. There's this common trope, especially for YA fantasy protagonists, where they can be a little bit arrogant. And I don't feel that Anakus ever gets into the arrogant territory. She's just confident and she knows who she is. And I really respect that about her. I also find her to be quite a likable character, and I loved the way that she developed really close friendships throughout the story. There are also some romances that happen, and one of the things that I really love about this is that Anakus is bisexual, and she starts to develop a romance with two characters in the story, one girl and one boy, and I really enjoyed the bisexual representation. I also really loved, like I kind of already touched on, just her bafflement at how homophobic this colonizing society is compared to her experience, because in her culture it is totally normal for women to get together or men to get together or any combination, and for there to be polyamorous unions and marriages where you have a larger support system, do all of your various tasks together and raise a family together, and there's no discrimination against those people, and it's not seen as wrong or weird or bad in any way. It's just part of the diversity of life and the different ways that love can manifest. And I really enjoyed that, and I really enjoyed her perspective, and I enjoyed her romances a lot. I think I said in the first half that I was definitely leaning toward her relationship with one character more than the other. By the end, I liked both of them. I thought they were both cute, and I liked what was implied at the end of the book, which is that maybe she won't end up having to choose just one of them. Maybe she can have it all, and I love the idea of that, so I'm very excited to read on in the series. I won't say the names of the love interests until I get into the spoiler section, because if you're reading it, I feel like following along as she develops her crushes initially is really fun, and so I don't want to ruin that for you if you're going to pick this up, which I would recommend you do. But I really liked that representation. I loved her friendships, especially with one character in particular who is very heavily autistic coded. It seems pretty clear to me that that was the intention, and I felt like that was really well done, and I really liked the way that Anakus just immediately accepted them for who they are and wasn't put out at all by accommodating their needs in the way that they requested their needs be met, and would stand up for them, and just generally their friendship in particular was really sweet. But she had a couple friendships that I was really drawn to, and I liked that that character had a sibling who was incredibly supportive as well and sort of stood up for them against the ableism of their mother in one particular scene, but just in general was very supportive and loving of their sibling and who they are and accepting of who they are. Yeah, I think this book did a really great job of so many things. I have little nitpicks as per usual. I feel like if you watch my videos, then you already know that if I'm good at anything, I'm good at nitpicking and having, niche critiques, and I certainly have those here too. To my knowledge, this is a debut novel, and while it is incredible for a debut, do not get me wrong, wow, if I could write a debut that's this good, I would be very happy. There are still a couple little things here and there that do make it feel a little bit maybe like a debut, and I'm sure that Black Goose will continue to improve on all these aspects as she keeps writing, but there were a couple little things. I did think the pacing was a touch uneven. It's pretty slow throughout, which is fine. I don't mind that at all, but then the ending felt pretty rushed. It felt like the last couple short chapters went through a lot and a lot of important stuff very quickly with an almost summary or epilogue feeling, which felt a little anticlimactic to me. I wanted those wrapping up conclusion things to have a little bit more space to breathe. And because most of the book was quite slow paced, it felt a little jarring for the ending to be so quick. This is the first book in a series, so it isn't the end of the entire story. We didn't need to sort of wrap everything up, which is fine, but it did feel just a touch rushed for me at the end. I also felt like the writing was a little bit detached, not overly so, but as I mentioned with my Fable reader summary, I am definitely an emotional reader. I'm an emotional person, human being, and I love to really dive deep into the emotions of the characters, and I feel like we didn't get quite as much of that as I would have loved. I think part of it is Anakus as a character. She is so self-assured and confident that we don't get a huge amount of her sort of questioning her path a little bit, but she's not necessarily a super emotional person, which is fine, but I think think that is usually my main entry point into a story and how I really connect the deepest to characters. And I did feel like there was a little bit of a detached quality to the writing style, which I would love to see sort of opened up a little bit, a little more connection in the next books in the series to the characters' emotions, just because that's something that I personally really enjoy. And the writing is wonderful. It's great. It's not quite as lyrical as my personal preference. Y'all know I love a super lyrical, almost, to the point of purple prose kind of writing style. This is not that. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just a different style than my preferred. But again, if I were to nitpick, I would love even more extensive descriptions, especially of the natural world around them. Those are some of my favorite aspects of a story, are those more detailed descriptions of the world and the setting that really draw you in and make it super immersive, and that evocative language. We're missing a tiny bit of that here. I couldn't really envision the landscape or the school in as much detail as I would have liked. I think that the best descriptions were of the dragons themselves, and I really enjoyed the detailed descriptions of the different dragons and the different types of dragon and what they looked like, and watching Kasakwa, Anakus's dragon, as she grows, because she starts off as a little newborn baby dragon and she is growing throughout the story, and I really loved seeing how she changed physically and her personality. I loved the dragons here, and I loved Kasakwa specifically. She is like a combination of a cat and a dog. Her personality kind of shifts throughout, but I just loved how playful she was and how much she loved the attention of children, especially her connection with Anakus, her silliness. Honestly, I think Kasakwa was the most emotionally vulnerable character and the one who I connected to the most on an emotional level, because she was very emotive in her behavior, even though she doesn't talk. So I really loved the dragons, and I really loved Kasakwa in particular, and I'm very excited for her to grow even further and for her connection with Anakus to grow further. We got a little bit of the ways that they're connected on a very deep level, but I imagine that will only grow in the following installments as Kasakwa grows to be a fully, grown dragon, and they have developed their skills and their connection even deeper. But the dragons were great. My only other real nitpick is with the world building, and the world building was fine. There's nothing glaringly wrong with it at all. Nothing wrong with it at all in general. It's just my personal preference. Again, for me, I love in fantasy for the world that we're in to either be basically just our worlds, but with magic, or for the world to be very different. So different shaped continents, different shaped countries, no similar names, just a completely brand new world that has no connection to our own. Here we have a world that is very similar to our own geographically and culturally in a lot of ways. Even the names are very similar, just slightly shifted to fit the naming conventions of this world. But things are different enough that I found myself getting confused. I did find it a little bit hard to follow because it was so similar and yet different that I started to kind of struggle with remembering what was basically the same as our world and what was different. That's probably just a me thing. Again, none of these nitpicks are, dings on this book at all in general, objectively. They're just my subjective feelings. And I think this is probably more of a me thing, but I did start to get a bit confused with the world building. And I think if it had been more different from our world or more similar, either direction, I think would have made it a little bit easier for me to follow. Speaking of confusing, I did find the magic system, or even more so the science system of this world and all the different subjects that they're studying at the school quite confusing. But in that case, it was not a drawback for me. I kind of loved being confused. I loved that Black Goose put so much effort into all these different areas of study and how the magic and the science and the technology and the math and all these aspects interacted and worked together. It felt very well thought out and very complex in a way that I love in fantasy. It really makes it feel like this is a fully realized world and all of this would work if you could figure it out. I did struggle to follow it sometimes and I got confused, but I'm not taking these exams, so it doesn't matter if I don't get it. And I didn't mind being a little confused. I kind of loved being slightly overwhelmed by all the information. I thought it was fun. So, in that case, being confused was actually a good thing. But again, that might be something for someone reading that they find it a bit overwhelming and that there's a little more detail in the science and technology and magic than they usually go for. I thought it was fun, so I kind of liked it in that case, but I did find the world building, the geography, the political system a touch confusing because of how similar similar it was, yet different. So I think those are all my nitpicks, but all that being said, I still really, really liked this. I'm giving this 4 stars. I thought it was great. I'm very excited to read on in the series. I could really see a later book in the series becoming a 5-star read for me, especially as Black Goose continues to write and has more experience, because a lot of the things that didn't quite perfectly click for me here, I think could sort of iron themselves out in a later installment in the series. And I would highly recommend this. If you are a fan of dragons, I think you will really like this. I think the themes are very well explored. I love the characters. I love the dragons. The story is pretty slow paced. I would almost say that most of the story, despite having, more serious subject matter and themes and dealing with things like racism and colonization, racially motivated violence or hate crimes, it has a lot of darker themes, but the way it's handled for the most part and the way most of the story goes, especially anytime Anakus is back on Masquapog, it has kind of a cozy slice of life feeling to it. So there is something very comforting about reading this despite the darker or more serious subject matter. And I think a lot of people will really vibe with this. So I would highly recommend 4 stars from me, and I'm very excited to read on in the series. I do have a couple spoilery thoughts to share, especially on the romances, because like I said, I didn't want to give anything away. So I'm going to do a spoiler section, and then I'm going to pick what I'm going to read next. And I have an inkling of what I'm going to read, but we'll see. We'll get to it. But first, spoilers for To Shape a Dragon's Breath. So warning, spoilers incoming. Skip this if you're going to read this book, which you probably should. Okay. As for the romances, the Theod romance was the one I was sort of iffy on. I do think it got a lot more development in the second half, and I ended up thinking they were cute together and kind of liking it. I do still think that she and Liberty have a better or deeper connection, and I'm sort of more invested in their romance, but I could see both parts working, and I really loved the implication at the end that Anakus is going to try to court both of them and has this dream that maybe she could marry them both in the future. I would love to see the polyamorous rep come through. I think that would be so sweet and lovely. I don't know the proper terminology, but I don't think Liberty and Theod would end up being romantically involved, because my impression is that Liberty is a lesbian, but I think that they could probably get along really well and have a great friendship. So I would love to see it. I think that would be great. I do wish that she had had at least one final scene with Liberty at the end. I felt like there were mentions of her and Liberty sewing together in some of the final chapters, but it was just, part of the sort of epilogue summary, rushing through the final events portion. And we didn't get a final moment of them saying goodbye before she left for the summer or any other moment between them. And that felt kind of lacking for me, especially because the final chapter is her and Theod going back to the islands together and talking about spending time together over the summer. And they got to have a bit of that sort of conclusion to their romantic arc for the first book. And Liberty felt sort of glaringly left out for me there. But still, I liked the romances. I thought they were sweet. The Theod part of the triangle grew on me. I did like the way the themes were expanded, and she ended up learning more about the political system and being able to connect to some of the sort of powerful men in charge near the end. I did feel like that was part of the book that was quite rushed, and I imagine that that will be expanded upon pretty significantly in the next book. So I'm sort of expecting that to go further, because she did save the life of a very powerful man who seems to be on the side of allowing Nakis to have much more self-determination and better representation within government. So I can see them sort of working together and her being able to attain more rights and freedoms for her people, which would be a great direction for the book to go. Like I said, it did feel a little bit rushed in this one, but I do think it was just setting up for book 2. So mostly we'll try to give that a pass. I also, as enraging as it was, really appreciated how the microaggressions and the misogyny and patriarchy were developed in this story. It was enraging, but it felt realistic. I thought that that was further expanded with Liberty and her experience as a Black woman and as an indentured servant who is trying to pay off her debt by working for 5 years, and the way that that sort of tied in, and the way the book in general kind of looked at class and wealth inequality and tied that in with racism and misogyny and this colonizer mindset. I think that was all handled really well, and I'm really excited to see how it keeps developing as the series goes on. That's it. That's it for spoilers, and those are all my thoughts for To Shape a Dragon's Breath. Like I said, there were a couple little nitpicks here and there that weren't quite perfect for me to make this a 5-star 5-star read, and I'm very excited for book 2 to come out later this year. So would highly recommend. Book 1 for this video down, 4 stars, great start. And now I need to pick what I'm gonna read next. Like I've mentioned before, I like to do mixed media reads where I can, so I listen to the audiobook as I read with my eyeballs. And I do think I just got a skip the line copy of the audiobook for one of the books earlier today. Let me just double check, because if so, I probably should do that one because it's a very popular book, and otherwise it's like months and months to wait to get the audiobook. Yes. So to take advantage of my library holds and the next 7 days, I'm going to read When the Moon Hatched. This beast of a brick of a book. How many pages is this again? It's so huge, it's kind of comical. Okay, 690 pages. Wow. Yeah, this is the one that I am most nervous about because I just feel like the reviews I've seen are so mixed and people have very wildly different opinions about this. I think this is the most romantic-y leaning book out of all the ones I have for this video. So that could also be potentially a drawback for me because I do struggle with a lot of romantic-y, just the very common tropes that are used, and the slightly more melodramatic tone of the romance tends to irk me deeply. So I'm really hoping that that doesn't happen here, but this also has dragons. So I'm excited for more dragons. Love dragons. Give me all the dragons. And I'm gonna stop delaying this. I'm gonna go start this. And when I get to the halfway point, which I guess is gonna be 345 pages or so, I will be back to share my mid-book thoughts. So for you, that'll be in a couple minutes. For me, that will probably be a couple days, but I will see you then. Hi, hello. I have gotten to the halfway point of When the Moon Hatched, which is quite the feat. I am 380 pages in. I have so many thoughts, so I'm going to try to kind of order them. I think I'm going to start with all the pros, everything that I'm liking so far, and then I'll kind of unleash myself to talk about the cons and the things that aren't working for me quite as well. So, pros first. I like the world building. I think it's interesting. One of the critiques I had heard of this book before I started it was that it was too complicated. There were too many made up words and having to go to the glossary to understand what's happening. That doesn't bug me at all. Maybe that's just a difference between the typical romantasy world building style and regular fantasy or high fantasy world building. I expect there to be a lot of terms that I don't know, and I don't need the book to stop and define everything as we go along. I kind of like picking up from context what things are, and then also, you know, if there's something that isn't quite as clear, having a glossary to refer to is nice, but that's not bothering me at all. I like that the world building is more extensive. I like that all the creatures are different, that the way this world is structured is different, that night and day is different, that time is tracked differently. All those things are interesting to me, so that's definitely a pro. I'm also liking the inclusion of dragons, and all of these made-up creatures are really cool, as well as the magic system, which I find interesting, that sort of elemental magic. I do, however, wish that the dragons and the other creatures were more extensively described. I feel like there's so much potential there to really dive in and really create this evocative description of what these creatures look like that is not always being taken advantage of, if that makes sense. I feel like I can sort of envision what they look like, but I'm not given enough description to fully paint a picture in my mind of what all these different strange creatures look like. And I'd like to be able to do that to really immerse myself. And then kind of same issue with the magic, just a little bit more explanation of how it works and what it feels like to call to these different gods and to experience these different types of magic. I feel like the most we've gotten of that is of the wind magic, which makes sense because our protagonist is most comfortable with that form of magic and the most proficient. But I just feel like there's a little bit missing even when she accesses that magic. it's a little vague for my taste. I would love more. And also, I find it interesting that given that this is a world where lots of people can do magic, there's not that much magic in this book so far. Maybe the second half is very magic heavy, but the first half is not. So that's kind of strange. And same thing with the dragons. There are apparently so many dragons in this world and so many different types of dragons. And yet so far there's not been a lot of dragon content either. So interesting. Again, maybe the second half is gonna do something different. But anyway, we have 3 different point of view characters, 2 in the present day and 1 further back in history. And I'm generally enjoying all 3. I think all 3 of the characters are interesting. They don't have the most distinct voices of all time, but there are differences in how their chapters are written, and I appreciate that. I am enjoying the chapters that take place further back in history, and I developed a theory about how that was connected to the modern timeline, and just in the last chapter that I read before stopping, that was confirmed. So I'm feeling pretty clever right now, even though I'm sure everyone who read this book also saw that coming, but I like to pat myself on the back when I correctly guess a twist or a reveal, so I'm feeling pretty chuffed about that. I like the characters as well, although they are pretty stereotypical romantic-y protagonist and male love interest, especially in their physical descriptions, but, you know, in general, their personalities are very romantic-y, copy and paste, which y'all already know if you spent any time here. I'm not a fan. I especially, you know, it's fine every once in a while to have characters with these types of personalities or who look like this. There's nothing wrong inherently with being a gigantic hulking man who is hard on the outside and soft and gooey on the inside, or being a tiny, skinny, yet curvy, badass warrior woman who also has like the most delicate beauty to have ever been seen and long flowing hair that never gets her in trouble in a fight and can take on 20 well-armed, trained men without even thinking twice or breaking a sweat because she's so badass. Those characters are fine. I don't mind reading about characters like that. What irks me is that it's every single book. Every book. Anyway, I was supposed to be talking about the pros and I'm getting into cons already. Ha, cons. The male main character's name is Khan, which if you're a Star Trek fan like I am, every time I read his name, I just hear Khan. And so that's kind of ruining the mood during certain scenes. Anyway, Rave is an interesting character. She's pretty funny. Sometimes her lines feel a little try-hard. I roll my eyes at her quips sometimes, but there are times that she has genuinely made me chuckle with some of her just ridiculous comments. She's such a hater. She's such a troll, and I find that pretty entertaining. She also just doesn't give a shit about doing what anyone else wants, which can be entertaining. I do think the way that she thinks about her own breasts is kind of weird. Just a note. Khan himself also, he's fine as a character. I think the constant descriptions of him as like a rippling tower of muscle is making me dislike him just because it's so annoying, and digging into one of my pet peeves, which is the most gigantic man you have ever seen in your whole life is the love interest. But he himself, you know, he seems like a chill dude, you know, he's fine. I don't mind him. We really don't have much of his internal life yet because he's had very few chapters, but I think he has an interesting backstory and I'm curious to learn more about him. I don't mind him. I like the way that he engages with Rave. I think they have fun banter back and forth. When it does get more into the realm of innuendo and sexual tension, it starts to get pretty cringy, but to me, that feels like more of an author, again, leaning into romantic-y tropes of how to write enemies to lovers, really antagonistic romance, which is just not my preference for romance at all. And also, again, feels a little repetitive because we see it so often. But I like him. And I also like Elwyn, the girl and then woman we're following in the past timeline, although her chapters tend to be pretty short. I am curious to see what happens next. I am somewhat engaged and interested in the plot, so there's that. But yeah, I think that's about it for positives. So moving on to the negatives, which I've already obviously started to touch on, you know, things like wanting more magic, more dragons, more description of how the magic works, more description of what the dragons and other creatures look like. I also find the writing pretty rough. It's not as terrible as a lot of people made it out to seem. It definitely is trying to balance out a more casual, sort of quippy, contemporary, sassy writing style with more of a fairy tale, traditional fantasy, more lyrical prose. prose, and it's not always doing a great job of blending the two. It does feel to me like the author is much more comfortable and much more proficient in the contemporary sassy sort of dialogue than she is in the more lyrical, poetic prose sort of writing. There is an excessive use of alliteration in this book, and I love alliteration. Weirdly obsessed with alliteration, if I'm being honest. It just scratches the right part of my brain, but even I feel like it is way overdone in this book. I told my husband about it, and he was shocked that I felt like it was too much alliteration, if that tells you anything. So let me give you an example, because I don't think me just saying it really is going to sway you, but you have to hear what it sounds like. Okay, there are so many examples, but I'm going to read the one page that I felt had the most alliteration on a single page that really struck me. And this was only on page 9, so it was really setting the scene. Okay, I'll start here. A swoop of steps leads me onto one of the many paths that wed through a cluster of luminous springs, steam rising from their turquoise depths. Folk are draped against their steps, heads tipped while they languish in the lapping warmth. A pretty paradise for those who wield enough power or political sway to keep themselves on the cushioned side of the crown. I huff out a bitter laugh. Here it's easy to pretend our colorful kingdom isn't nesting on a bed of bones. And then there is one tiny little paragraph with no alliteration, so I'll skip over it. And then we get, head swiveling unnaturally, the waif looks right at me, sniffs the air, then releases a gluttonous gasp. Well, 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 isn't your soul a plump, juicy thing? Ah, how kind of you to say. I'll just be on my way. Almost got a rhyme there, but got cut off too soon. There are screaming spirits desperate to speak with you. How about a small suckle of your soul? The creature asks, and I swear it sounds like it's salivating. In that final paragraph, I even missed one of them when I was initially highlighting it, but we have, there are screaming spirits desperate to speak with you. How about a small suckle of your soul? The creature asks, and I swear it sounds like it's salivating. That is an excessive number of words that start with S in a single paragraph. Oh my God. And it's a short paragraph. It's like 3 sentences long. It's not that excessive all the way through, but it does come up regularly enough that I am finding it is really pulling me out of the story. So there's that with the writing style, which I think is meant to give it more of that fantasy fairy tale sort of feel. Oh no, I just did the same thing. It's leaking into my brain. It's just not, it's not working for me. Another thing that's bugging me about the writing style in general is that it tends to do these really short, punchy paragraphs, which is fine, but at the end of a paragraph, it'll sort of repeat a statement to drive it home. So you'll have a short paragraph and then a little phrase, and then a couple paragraphs and then a short paragraph and a little phrase. And it goes over and over and over again. So you'll be reading a paragraph and it ends with, slowly loosening each muscle, convincing myself there's nothing here that wants to hurt me, to battle me. The words are forced past gritted teeth, that immense icy presence within me shifting, rumbling. That kind of irks me. It just becomes really repetitive when it's used constantly, and it does kind of lend a bit of a melodramatic tone to the writing, which is not my favorite, personally. Also, everyone always smells everyone else. There's a lot of smelling, which is odd. I don't know why everyone has such a great sense of smell. Maybe that's, an aspect of them being fae, but it's never been explained, and it's just weird and creepy to me how often people can smell each other. Also, the main character has an internal icy lake, which I'm assuming is supposed to be, it's like her mind palace, what she uses to be able to navigate within her mind and sort of lock certain things away and access certain parts of her power. It has never been explained, and it's unclear if it's something more literal to do with being fae or to do with having magic, or if it is just a metaphor and just, the way that she conceptualizes her own mind. But the number of times that weird metaphors are used with her icy lake in her brain is kind of odd. For example, this one, which I thought was very weird imagery, something about the way he rasps the word cuts me down the middle, like he's stuffing those big, strong arms into my frosty depths, churning my lake into a storm of slush. Like, okay. An example of all the sniffing. I'll purchase your sentence and have you out by the rise, the male says, just stalking by my cell when he stops, drawing a deep sniff of the air, his head turning in my direction slower than a setting aurora. Like he smells her in the middle of this dank, presumably disgusting smelling prison full of people who have not washed in a very long time, but he picks out her scent of everyone. Silly. Oh, also, again, I assume this is a fae thing, but it's grossing me out a little bit. Men and women are only ever referred to as males and females by everyone all the time, which just, gives me bad vibes. And sometimes she really talks like an alien. Again, I think it's that attempt to make things sound a little more formal and fancy. But at one point she's talking about a pregnant woman who she meets, and she talks about her babe-laden abdomen, which is such an odd way to phrase that and completely unnecessary. At one point she's trying to escape and she like creeps down the stairs, and her hulking male love interest is lying on the couch completely naked with just a throw blanket of fur, just conveniently covering only his nether regions, and the rest of his, magnificent, sculpted from stone, gigantic body is on display. And then she's sort of, struck by his raw carnal power and decides not to escape and instead to try to fuck him. So there's that. He gives her a really affectionate, intimate feeling nickname from like their second meeting, and she doesn't seem to question it at all or ever tell him not to call her that, which is very odd to me based on her personality. My Moonbeam. If someone gave me a nickname like that I had met twice, I would hold a grudge against them for literally the rest of time because it's so fucking weird. Anyway, oh yeah, here's a good one. This is one of the ones I was looking for. Khan dominates the crater, each long stride hailed by another shake of the ground. His body a tower of rippling brawn, dappled with sweat that glistens in the sun, his scars pale against the rusty surrounds. Like, his body is a tower of rippling brawn, and each step he takes literally shakes the ground. Like, at this point, I'm just envisioning a literal giant. Like, someone who is easily 10 times her size. It's ridiculous. It's so over the top. Like, every time someone writes a character like this, they have to describe them as even more gigantic than every other male love interest we've ever seen, because otherwise they're not going to be impressive anymore. Like, the standards are really through the roof. It's wild. Anyway, moving on from the writing, I've already mentioned that the pacing is pretty slow. I don't mind reading books with less plot or just a much slower paced plot. That's fine to me. I do think that this is very long for what it is so far. If we were getting a much deeper exploration of the characters and really diving into what makes them tick and getting way more exploration of the world and the magic and the creatures and everything was really evocatively described, I think it would make more sense to need this much time and this many pages to get where we're going. But as it is, it does feel very drawn out. But I did have one sort of final point that came up just in the last couple chapters that is causing me to give this book the side eye, and that is the introduction of the Jakul clan. They are sort of a warrior people and they live a much more simple life. And she is from a big city working in the underground of this metropolis, basically. So she shows up and she's interacting with these people, and her perspective on them feels very questionable. The way she describes them, the way that they are described to like fall at her feet, and they are described as rabid and feral and other such words that very much give me pause. I have questions. Okay, I have questions. There's that, and that's sort of the biggest thing for me so far that just popped up right in the last couple chapters, so I've barely had time to process it, but I'm very surprised that more people don't seem to be talking about that because I felt like that was pretty weird, the way that was handled. Anyway, I've been talking for an hour, and the sun has gone down while I've been talking, so I'm gonna go and finish this. Another 300-ish pages to go, and then I'll be back to share my final thoughts. I really hope that it can sort of move away from some of the stuff that is not quite working for me and deliver something great, because I feel like this has a lot of potential to be a great story. If I were to give a rating right now, it would probably be around 2 to 3 stars, but we'll see where it goes. Hi, it's 1 a.m. and I just finished When the Moon Hatched. Most of my thoughts are the same that I had in the first update. All the same things I liked about the first half, I continued to like in the second half. All the qualms I had, all my nitpicks, all my criticisms continued to exist in the second half. A little too much alliteration, some weird similes and metaphors that were a little unnatural and confusing at times. Pretty slow pacing, although it did pick up in the second half, I will say that. Not a huge amount of plot overall, but that's not really a drawback for me personally. I don't really mind a lack of plot necessarily. The characters continued to grow on me. I did still feel like they were a bit generic. Felt like Khan's chapters were kind of reduced to make room for some of these other characters, and I didn't feel like the other point of view character chapters were necessary. I feel like those plot points could have been told through other characters. I just feel like we didn't get quite as much extra development for our main couple as I was hoping in the second half, especially as things start to progress and they get to know each other better and things are revealed about their histories. I just wanted a little bit more internal exploration of how all of this feels for them, especially for Khan. I actually found the writing of the spicy scenes less cringy than a lot of romantic-y spicy scenes that I've read. Sometimes like romance sex scenes as well. I feel like there's usually a lot of really cringy dialogue during the scenes themselves. And in this case, I felt like it was less focused on that and more on physical activity, which maybe is just my preference. But anyway, I also felt like a lot of the cringy, very trope-laden descriptions of their bodies reduced a lot in the second half. It became more an exploration of their trauma and their wounds and their emotional connection. And also, I mean, they also have sex, but I don't necessarily really mind when books are longer. I think that can be fine. I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with allowing a story space to breathe, but I do feel like once you're starting to get towards the 700 page mark, like this book is a brick. I could knock someone out with it. It's a lot, you know, and it didn't have to be. Cut in half might be a bit much, but it could easily lose a third of its pages and still tell the same story. It would just be a tighter story, you know, maybe a more focused story. Some of the writing stuff still stuck with me as being pretty awkward. Also, oh yeah, I will say the writing, like I said, of the spicy scenes generally was less cringy than other scenes I've read in my life, but there was one sentence from Khan that made me roll my eyes so hard that I swear they got stuck for a second. And that sentence was, "Once you're so wound up, your entire body's shuddering, I'd spread you, marvel you, then split you like an egg." Which is just some really fucking weird imagery, if you ask me. If anyone ever said this to me, I would immediately get the ick for all time. Just saying. But other than that one sentence, I thought some of it was melodramatic. It's not, you know, highbrow literature. It's not the most incredible, gorgeous, evocative and lyrical writing I've ever read. It's not, you know, a sex scene so beautifully written that I'm sobbing into my pillow from the sheer beauty and romance of it all. But not as bad as a lot of scenes I've read, which is saying something because it seems like it's pretty hard to write sex scenes that don't make me want to crawl up into a tiny ball and die like dragons turning into moons. So we continue to not get as much about the dragons or the magic system as I would like. It does seem like there'll be more close contact with dragons in the next book based on how this one ended. But if a book is sold as being about dragons, I want all the dragon lore. I want to know what the dragons look like and how they act in different settings, their personality. I want to know how they interact with their people versus other people. I want to know how they interact with each other. And that's something I really loved about To Shape a Dragon's Breath. I feel like the dragons had so much personality and they were so fun, and you really felt like you could tell which dragon it was just by their behavior. And we got to know about so many different types of dragons and how they differ in their appearance. This one, we got that a little bit. There are different types of dragons. They are suited to different environments. They do have different appearances, and we did learn a little bit about it, but it just felt like, again, for a book that it seems so focused on trying to create this more lyrical writing style, to really leave out all of the deeply evocative evocative descriptions of all these different creatures' appearances and really getting into the nitty-gritty. It just felt like a missed opportunity for me. I struggled to imagine what a lot of these creatures looked like, and that's really usually the trade-off for me. I feel like I don't mind more wordy language if it's either really beautiful, and so I just enjoy the words and the combinations of words, or if it's not, just beautiful in and of itself, it's at least very descriptive to the point that I can really immerse myself and I really feel like I'm there. I have that sense of place. I can imagine every tiny detail. And I feel like this book kind of didn't do either. So that's unfortunate. But I didn't hate it. I enjoyed reading it for the most part, despite my qualms, despite using many, many, many tabs for awkward writing choices and eye-rolling moments. I still liked it. I liked the characters. I was rooting for them. I thought the world was interesting. I liked spending time in it. I was curious to know what happened next. I chuckled at a few moments. I felt a few moments were very cathartic, a couple little mini revenge moments that I appreciated. I was interested in Rave as a character and the development of her backstory and her personality. Was it a bit repetitive at times? Yes. But is it repetitive trying to heal from trauma? Yes. So it felt realistic. Khan, I feel like we didn't learn as much about him as I wanted to, but I liked him. He seemed like a pretty good dude, despite being described repeatedly as just many boulders stacked on top of each other with a beard. He seemed like a nice guy and a good cook, which, I always appreciate as someone who cannot cook to save my life. So this book has way more violence and way more explicit, gory violence than I expected, especially with this cover. This cover makes it seem almost like a YA fantasy, or at least something it makes me think of the Elizabeth Lim Six Crimson Cranes. It has a very similar sort of really flowery, artistic, soft cover, and I feel like this does not represent at all what this book is, like at all. Every time I closed the book to take a break from reading and I looked at the cover, I just thought, this cover is not right. It's not dark and bloody enough for this book. But yeah, I think I'm gonna give it 3 stars, a solid 3, which means I liked it, it was good, didn't blow me away, wasn't fantastic, wasn't great, wasn't a new favorite. An acknowledgement of its flaws while still acknowledging that I had a pretty good time while reading it overall, and I will probably read on in the series. So that is When the Moon Hatched. I'm going to do a little spoiler section to talk about some of the reveals in the second half. So you can skip over the spoiler section and go to me starting the next book. But if you want to hear spoilers, keep watching. So When the Moon Hatched, spoilers. So I was right, as I said, that she was Elwyn, and it turns out her story was much sadder than I had initially thought. I mean, we already knew early on that her whole family was murdered, so her story was already sad. But the fact that what actually happened is that she and Khan ended up falling in love after her family was murdered and her kingdom taken over, basically. And she was told, you're not old enough to rule and you can't rule alone, so you will be married off to this man who is cruel and you don't love, have his children, and be tethered to the Aether Stone, which is basically sucking your life force out of you slowly and driving you mad, and that will be your existence. And meets her soon-to-be brother-in-law, Khan, and they end up falling in love because of, a slow breaking down of her walls from him, of cooking for her and showing her kindness and understanding. And then she gets pregnant. Future father-in-law finds out and tells her that her only chance to get her kingdom back and to protect everyone involved is to marry her intended husband as soon as possible and to pretend that this baby is his. All this horrible stuff will happen. So she thinks she's protecting him and making the only choice she can make by leaving and marrying his brother. And then she dies in childbirth, and her dragon is so distraught that she bursts in and picks her up and flies up to the sky and wraps her up tight and dies and solidifies into a moon around her. And over an eon, slowly, somehow, this isn't really explained, but over time, seemingly maybe gave her life force to save Elwyn's life. And at some point after this long process, falls from the sky, and Elwyn is found and brought to this, fighting ring. Basically, it's like gladiators fighting, and is tortured. Her dragon pieces are collected and sold off, and over many years, Khan has been searching for all the pieces to put them back together to try to rebuild her dragon. She has no memory of her life before, and her daughter doesn't know that her mother is still alive and doesn't know that her uncle is actually her father, and vice versa. My favorite parts of this book were those chapters with Elwyn, both the early stages of her growing up and her family and her relationship with her brother, and insights into her mother's experience with the Aether Stone, but then also the later chapters of falling in love with Khan, and for them it being a traditional love story. It wasn't enemies to lovers or anything. It was just a slow building of trust and care into this great love, and I found that much more endearing than the traditional at each other's throats adversarial love story. I really appreciated that backstory. I predicted it happening, but I didn't predict everything happening exactly the way it did. Rave, her guardedness and her really intense walls, preventing anyone from getting close to her, make more and more sense as you get more of her backstory and learn how often she has had anyone she's ever loved murdered or taken away from her, and how much she suffered, and the scenes of her being repeatedly burned and tortured, trying to toughen her up to fight in the pits, basically, by repeatedly scalding her and burning her all over her body, which is how she developed this really intense fear of fire. I hope that Khan and Rave/Elwyn can end up together and be happy. I think they deserve that. I would love for them to have a happily ever after. That would be great. I assume that we will get there eventually after however many books are planned. I hope they are not forced to suffer for an extended period of time and they're allowed to just be together as they maybe fight Khan's brothers and try to eliminate corruption from the land and so on. All the flashback scenes of him and Elwyn falling in love and just being happy and blissful were really sweet, and I would love more of that. I think that would be nice. So yeah, spoilers done. That's when the moon hatched. It is pretty late. It's now 1:40 a.m., so my brain is a little scrambled, but I'm gonna pick what I'm gonna read next. We have The Spear Cuts Through Water, The Will of the Many, and Blood Over Brighthaven. So I think I'm gonna read The Spear Cuts Through Water next. I have heard so many good things about this. I feel like everyone I've seen talk about this, all the booktubers I watch who have talked about this have raved about it and loved it with their whole heart. So I feel like that is a good sign that I am also going to love this and give it 5 stars. At least I hope so. So I'm gonna go start this, not right now because it's almost 2 a.m. and I need to go to sleep, but tomorrow morning I will start it, and when I get to the halfway point, I'll be back to give you my initial thoughts. Okay, so I'm halfway through The Spear Cuts Through Water, and I have thoughts, but not as many as I usually do. The first thing I will say about this is that this is definitely written in a very lyrical style, and it's written in a bit of an experimental style as well. Honestly, it reminds me a lot of the 5th season and the whole Broken Earth trilogy, which is over here on my shelves, by N.K. Jemisin. And if you've read that series, you'll kind of know where I'm coming from, with a less than common perspective and writing style in general that might be kind of confusing to some people. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people were confused while reading this. Honestly, I've been confused at times. There are definitely moments where I have to flip back for a page or two and try to figure out whose perspective I'm in, because all of a sudden it feels like I'm in a different time and place, and there's no indicator, there's no external indicators of switching perspectives and who it is that's thinking. It's a lot of second person, you do this, you do that, you feel this, you do that. But it also, flips between other perspectives as well. We go to third person, we go to first person plural. It's kind of all over the place. And I don't necessarily mind that in and of itself. I think it's interesting. It definitely is confusing at times, though. I will say that. There is something to be said for a book that switches perspectives from chapter to chapter and has a little label at the start of the chapter for which character's head you're going to be in, or shows when you're going between timelines. This book is not interested in telling you that. It's just interested in telling the story. And it definitely, I think, feeds into, I imagine, what the author was trying to do, which is tell the story in the style of oral tradition, tell the story as if it's being recalled in snippets by a boy who was told all these stories by his grandmother when he was young. And, he remembers a little bit there, he remembers a little bit here, he sort of breaks out to say something outside of the story and then jumps back in. It's a little bit more fragmented, it's a little more naturalistic, and it also has a very fairy tale, dreamlike, atmospheric, kind of hazy quality to it, which, if you've been here for a while, I love all of those things. All of those words are good words for me. So as much as there are definitely times where I get a bit lost and I have to sort of refocus back in and flip back and reread a passage, which is not very common for me, I don't mind because I am really enjoying this. I will also say the writing is gorgeous. The writing style itself is beautiful. It is very lyrical. It is very poetic. Just beautiful words strung together. It's very evocative. It really paints a picture of these characters and the places and what's happening, but it also is just told in the most beautiful way possible. I don't know how to describe it. I'll probably read a couple examples for you, but I think I said on page 7 that I was already enthralled by the writing because it was just so gorgeous. And that has stayed true throughout, although I will say it has become a little bit more straightforward as the plot has started to pick up, which I think makes sense to kind of keep things moving. But there are quite a few moments where I just sort of pause and go back and reread a paragraph, not because I'm confused, but because I just want to bask in the glory of the words because they're so beautiful. So that is definitely a plus for me. I love beautiful lyrical writing and I'm enjoying the story so far. I will definitely say it is higher on the gorgeous writing and atmosphere side of things and a little lower on the plot side of things. The plot is moving pretty slowly, which is fine. That's not necessarily a drawback, but I think that will be a drawback for a lot of people. So I wanted to make sure to communicate that because if you are someone who's not really a fan of low to no plot books, this might not be your jam. Although, again, I'm only halfway through, so maybe the second half is all action, all plot, and things have happened. I think one of my pet peeves is when people describe books as being completely plotless when they actually aren't, because I have read a few books that I would say are literally plotless and nothing happens. But usually there is a plot, even if it is very slow moving and not the most action-packed, exciting thing ever. Things are happening, it's just happening slowly. I'm having a really good time. I really like the characters. I'm not sure 100% who the protagonist is meant to be. It's sort of an ensemble piece, which I don't mind so much. Probably at this point, Kima feels the most like a protagonist. He seems to be sort of our window into this world and this story in a lot of ways, although there is another unnamed character who is more literally our window into the world, but that character is not nearly as present in the story after the first couple, I was going to say chapters, but there aren't any chapters in this either, so know that. There are no chapters. There aren't really any breaks in the storytelling. It's kind of all one continuous thing. It is split into parts, but those are pretty big chunks of text. And I really like Kima. I think he's a really interesting character. I'm enjoying his relationship developments with various characters, and I find the other characters fascinating as well. I think this is a fantasy story and there is magic, but the magic isn't really defined at this point. It seems like this one goddess essentially has imparted her magic on a select few, and those select few have pretty much unlimited power in a bunch of different areas, but it's not really defined how that works at all. And in some ways it does feel a little convenient where people seem to develop exactly the power they need in the moment. I mean, they could have had that power all along, but it doesn't come up until the moment it's needed, which also makes sense, in general, but also does feel convenient at times because there is just no explanation. So literally anything can happen. They can do whatever they want. I don't hate that, but I do tend to prefer a little bit more of a defined magic system. I just find it interesting. I like when authors really dive into how magic works in their world. And so far that hasn't happened. And also almost every fantasy I've ever read, definitely more similar to, like I said, the 5th season, although the 5th season was more plot driven than this. Or maybe something like Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. Again, a very dreamlike, hazy, lyrically written story that is also lower on the plot side of things. I'll just read one passage from page 7. This is the passage that made me write the note about being enthralled by the writing style, because it's very early on. No spoilers whatsoever, but it kind of gives you a sense of the writing style. She exhaled, and the smoke blown in from the dark envelops you until all you can see are the curls of gray matter swirling around you, the thick fog seeming to lift you, to cradle you, bearing you gently downward until you light upon a smooth, hard surface and the smoke clears. The memory of your Lola in the kitchen fading as day does to dusk, before you find yourself standing before the very place she had once spoken of all those years ago. Okay, I'll do another early example because, again, I don't want any spoilers. Once the moon and the water were in love. She lingered on that word, love, just as the smoke lingered in the air. You can imagine it was not the most convenient affair. One was trapped in the heavens, the other the earth. One was stillness itself, the other made only of waves and tempests. But they were happy for a time. The moon would bathe the water in its radiance, and the water would dance with its ebb and flow to the moon's suggestion. And though they occupied different spheres, they were able to visit one another through less direct means, for there is no barrier in this life that love cannot overcome. The water would send up to the skies plump storm clouds, swollen with its essence, its cool mist and the salty breath kissing the moon's dry and cracked surface. And the moon, when it wished to visit the water, would cast its reflection into the water's surface, and in the inverted world that lies suspended below our own, in glass and still water, they would meet and dance and make love. So anyway, those are just some examples of the writing style. Again, it's not exactly like that all the way through. There are portions that are a little bit more straightforward to kind of move the plot along, but a lot of it is written like that, and I am loving it. I think it's absolutely gorgeous, and there are just so many combinations of words and sentences and whole paragraphs that I've just, full hard eyes getting giddy and excited as I read them. So this is definitely one for the lyrical purple prose fans, as I am one. Oh, also one more thing before I jump into the shortest spoiler section ever. This is a lot more violent and gory and bloody than I expected going into it. Kind of like When the Moon Hatched, where going into it, I really did not expect the level of violence and gore that I was going to get. Same thing here. There's a lot of blood and dismemberment and murder and descriptions of pretty gross ways that bodies can be mutilated and messed up and people can be murdered. Some because of magic and some not. So just keep that in mind. As always, when I finish the books, I will share my book card and I'll list all of the content warnings I can think of, but definitely just be aware that this is pretty bloody and gory, and sometimes it has really grossed me out, so just keep that in mind. And that is it for my mid-book update for The Spear Cuts Through Water. I'm excited to finish this and see where it goes in the second half, so I'm gonna go do that, and I'll be back when I'm done. Just finished The Spear Cuts Through Water like 30 seconds ago. And you know what? I feel like I went through so many different emotions while reading this. I, shared my thoughts after the first 50%, and I was intrigued. I was liking the writing, but I was feeling like there was something missing. I wasn't entirely in love. And in the second half, probably until the 90% mark, I was almost liking it less than I did for the first 50%. I was thinking it was a little too convoluted for my taste. I was not understanding why these new characters were introduced right near the end and were taking so much page time and sort of becoming the new protagonists when we didn't know anything about them, and I didn't necessarily care about them. And I just felt like maybe this wasn't the book for me, and I was starting to kind of second guess all the recommendations and wondering why this wasn't working for me, because it was so beautifully written, but it just felt like it was gorgeous writing without the soul to back it up. But it felt like the potential was there, so I was just feeling very frustrated and kind of struggling. And then when I got to the last 10%, it's like everything came together for me. All of a sudden, I was so deeply emotionally invested. It's like everything clicked. The last terror and their story just punched me in the gut. And then everything that was happening with June and Kima at the end, was just a great conclusion of their character arcs and their journey and their relationship. And the story itself, it became so fast-paced. It was so heart-pounding. I feel like the last 50 pages I just read at super speed, and my heart was racing, and I was so pulled in and invested. And I cried a bunch in the last 20 pages, especially. So here we are. I honestly don't know how to rate this, because on the one hand, I don't think this is a perfect book. I do think in some ways the form, as cool and unique and beautiful as it was, did get in the way of the story at times. It also felt a little long, especially in the middle. I feel like the pacing was so slow, and not everything that was in here needed to be in here. It felt a little superfluous, a little circuitous, a little bit like it was languishing in its own beauty, which I don't mind for a little bit, but it felt like there were easily 200 pages in here of that, which is a little much for me, But then on the other hand, some of the most gorgeous writing I've read in a really long time, a really beautiful story, characters that I fell in love with, and that ending just really pulled everything together. If a book makes me cry, usually that's a good sign that I loved it. And so I'm just feeling a bit conflicted right now, because up until that last 50 pages or so, I would probably have rated this around a 3-star, trying to balance all the different things I felt about it. But after that ending, I don't know, because I feel like my heart is telling me to rate it 5 stars because of how much I cried, how much I'm feeling about this right now. But on the other hand, my brain is saying it wasn't a 5-star all the way through. For the majority of the book, you were feeling conflicted and sort of wondering why it was taking so long to develop the story, and some of the side quests and some of the added characters that didn't feel like they really added anything to the story. So I don't know. I mean, not every book has to be edited to within an inch of its life. It doesn't have to be the tightest, most fast-paced, most focused story ever. I just felt like there was a lot of meandering here. And again, I just don't feel that served the story. And I think the story could have been more impactful with a little bit more tight editing, removing some of those side characters, or just giving them smaller parts. You don't have to cut out any of these characters, but maybe if their sections of the book were shorter or included as more of like a dreamlike sequence, like a lot of the other characters and experiences throughout, maybe that would have kept things moving a little bit better and kept me feeling like the story had a purpose at all times, because it felt like it lost sight of its purpose quite a few times, especially in the middle chunk of the book. So I think right now I'm going to give it 4 stars, because I feel like that is the more logical, more fully encompassing of my entire experience rating. But as per always, I reserve the right to change my rating later if I feel I need to. And in this case, that would probably mean bumping it up to 5 stars if I feel in my heart that is right. It's a very high 4 stars. It is very close to being 5 stars, despite everything that I didn't like about it or all the struggles I had with it, which is saying something. I feel like I'm just going to reiterate everything, but the writing is stunning. Is it a bit confusing at times? Yes. Is it a touch convoluted at times? Yes. Do I think that maybe there were moments that we could have used a little bit more of a straightforward writing style to help us kind of move along and make what was happening a little clearer? Yes. yes, but I did like the experimental style. I did like how stylized it was. I did love how it felt like someone just telling you a fairy tale with lots of interjections from other people in the room, and remembering things at the last second and having to add it in, and, you know, other people's impressions and reactions to the story. It did kind of feel like a send up to oral storytelling, which I appreciated and thought was really lovely. I loved the words. I loved languishing in the words. Just like I feel like the story sometimes loved languishing in its own words a little too much. It's a pretty simple plot. Not that much happens, and it is dragged out over 500 pages, but it's not action heavy, and that's okay. I did feel like the ending was the strongest part of the book by far, both sort of the emotional conclusion to the story, the way the character arcs resolve themselves, but also just the pacing was great. The stakes were huge. The third terror was the most fascinating and complex and layered of the sort of antagonistic characters through the story that we were introduced to right at the end there. And it was just very emotional and overwhelming in how emotional it made me, and I thought it was gorgeous. So I definitely feel a little bit like I had to kind of push myself through the middle section to make it to the end and get that payoff. I wish I didn't feel like I'd had to force myself a bit to keep going through the middle, which is why I feel like maybe a little bit more editing in that middle section could have helped things move along a little faster, be a little more smooth in the transition from the first part into the second part. It did feel like the story kind of lost track of itself in the lulls between each terror. The three sons of the emperor who they are taking on, in between facing each son, there was a bit of a lull, and I feel like in each of those lulls, things kind of lost the plot a little bit. But yes, I think right now I'm sitting at 4 stars for this, and I thought it was fantastic. It's a really unique, very special book, and I would highly recommend it if what I've said about it appeals to you, but definitely this is not going to be the book for everyone. Those are my non-spoilery thoughts for The Spear Cuts Through Water. I will do a little bit of a spoiler section, and then we'll move on to the next book. So spoilers now for The Spear Cuts Through Water. Skip this if you don't want spoilers, because I'm going to talk about the ending, so you've been warned. So yeah, the basic structure is that they have to face and take down the 3 sons of the emperor to kind of end this tyrannical reign. The emperor was killed by his wife, the moon goddess, and his 3 sons need to die so that the land can be free. And the first son has the ability to control the weather and the elements, and he is June's father. And I did find him to be a really interesting figure because he was so ruthless and violent, but he did have this really soft spot for his son. And even when his son betrayed him and later on sort of redoubled on that and told him he would never join him again, he still maintained that he would save his life or that he would protect him. So I found that interesting, and I appreciated that nuance for him as a character. It was also interesting that they cut off his head, but he didn't die, and he just kept talking as a disembodied head until some of his other sons found his body and sewed his head back on. I mean, I guess this is, they're sons of a god, so they have, a different reality when it comes to mortality. But he was an interesting character, and I kind of liked that first, killing of one of the sons sort of was dragged out, and he kind of went along with them for a while before he was involved in the altercation with the second son. Their mother being the one to end the first and second terror's lives, sort of together as one, felt quite poetic because she is the one who created them and gave them the power that they then used to terrorize this whole land. The second son was definitely the most cruel and the most vicious and the most unsettling and disturbing to read about. He had mind control powers where he could force people to do or say whatever he wanted and to feel like they wanted to do his bidding. And he used it to, torture people, essentially, is in a variety of very disgusting ways. He seemed to get a lot of joy from forcing people to soil themselves and to have sex with people and animals that they wouldn't choose to, and to kill people they love, or to, there was one example where he loved a dance performance so much that he forced one of the dancers to do it over and over and over and over and over again until her feet were bleeding and she was throwing up from the exertion and in so much pain and distress. And he just kept forcing her to do it again and again and again for his entertainment. He also, on multiple occasions, ate sentient beings while they were still alive. He drugged the mother of all the magical tortoises and kept her alive as he ate the majority of her body. So that's lovely. And then he ate his own mother's finger, actually 2 of her fingers, while she was still alive. So yeah, he was definitely the most unsettling, the creepiest, the most reprehensible of the 3, and I was glad that his section was quite short because I found his chapters or sections of the book quite disturbing. And then the 3rd terror was honestly just very sad. The 3rd terror was born with the ability to transform itself into different forms and was basically kept in a hole for his entire life, wanting love, wanting to be able to play with his brothers, wanting the love of his parents for his whole life, and just living in a pit. And, unsurprisingly, he did not learn how to interact with others or, really know what it meant to receive or give kindness. And sort of that self-fulfilling prophecy of turning into the monster that they thought he was from birth by dropping other people in a pit and sort of playing with them and healing them and then hunting them and injuring them and then healing them again to repeat until they die, and just repeating that through his life. He seems to be a very underdeveloped emotionally and intellectually. He has the mind of a child still, despite being in his 40s, I think, at this point. And he ends up falling in love with Kima because Kima releases him when he's in the form of a bird. When Kima rejects him, he sort of loses it. And just the whole ending of him, he's stabbed with the spear, he transforms into this giant version of himself. He is desperate to find his mother. It's very unsettling. It's very upsetting. I was crying reading his passages and just feeling how cruel it was for him to be treated that way. And just the injustice of it all, I guess, is where I was really trapped. This idea that he had no chance to ever have the love that he should have had. And as much as he tortured and killed many people, and in some ways could be seen to be just as evil as his other brothers, his reason for doing it was so different, and his ability to understand why and what he was doing was so different, and the amount of love and support he received was so different that it was hard not to feel empathy for him and to just feel so sorry for him. And his ending was just heartbreaking and devastating. So that was a lot. But I definitely feel like the moment that really got to me the most at the end was Kima and June finally sort of admitting their love for each other. They sacrificed themselves to save the land from this tsunami and were saved and given back their bodies and returned to land. June tried to leave without Kima's knowledge because he knew he would be chased down for the rest of his life for being basically the only living grandson of the emperor, and he didn't want Kima to have to live a life on the run, essentially, and constantly in danger. And as soon as Kima learns this, regardless of what he's being offered and what wealth and power he would be given for his sacrifice, he just immediately needs to go find June. And when he catches up with him and they have that moment of realization that they love each other, and there's a line, I think he says, it made me laugh and also cry. Where is it? He said, it was actually right before they sacrificed themselves to the wave. June looked over at Kima and Kima looked over at June. "I would have won," Kima said, "if we had ever had a proper duel. Fully rested, I would have won." June smiled. "Fuck off," he said, which to Kima's ears had the same melody as "I love you," which made me laugh and then tear up. And then later when they meet each other, it's really lovely and they finally kiss for the first time, and they're talking about how the theater is going to be reenacting everything they do, and isn't it, embarrassing that they're going to reenact them kissing. Kima asks, "Would you stop if they were?" "No," June said firmly. "They have already seen my life. They have seen my most shameful moments." The pained look in his eyes quickly faded as he gazed into Kima's. "Why would I deny them one of my most beautiful?" Which also made me cry. And it's really sweet the way it ends, and you really don't know how long they're going to be able to live like this, because June is a target, because he is the only one left of this tyrannical line, and a lot of people will want him dead, and he killed a lot of people and maybe deserves it, but you get the feeling that he and Kima will at least get a few years of this nomadic life and of love and bliss together first, and it was really beautiful. Okay. like them dancing together before the wave took them. Just, yeah. The whole ending, they're the slowest of slow burns of all time for their relationship, literally from when they first meet to the final couple pages where they finally kiss for the first time, and we finally get some very vaguely described sex scenes for them. Wow, yeah, such a slow burn. But I really loved them. I was really rooting for them, and I'm glad they at least got some moments together, even if we don't know, it's a happily for now, not necessarily a happily ever after, but I think that makes sense for this world. I feel a little bit dazed, to be honest. Like I just woke up from the weirdest dream I've ever had. That's kind of what I feel like. But I think that's it for spoilers. I just kind of wanted to talk about the terrors in a little bit more detail and also chat about Kima and June. I feel like someone smacked me repeatedly in the face with this book, to be honest. This was a beautiful book. Highly recommend if you like gorgeous writing, low plot, don't mind a very slow burn, and don't mind sort of an experimental writing style that can feel a bit circuitous and convoluted at times, but has a great payoff, because that is definitely this. Now that I've finished the third book for this reading vlog, I can't believe it's only been 3. I feel like I've been run through the gambit with these already. Let's pick up book 4 for this video, which is going to be The Will of the Many. Off I go to read this, and I'll be back when I get to the 50% mark, about 300 pages in, to share my initial thoughts. Hello, I'm back again. I'm halfway through The Will of the Many, and this one is going probably the fastest out of all the books so far. I feel like this one is imminently readable. It's very straightforward in its prose, and it has pretty great pacing so far, so I'm pretty immersed. I'm pretty interested in what's going to happen and enjoying it so far. For the most part, I do typically prefer or lean towards more lyrical, really beautiful writing. This is not very lyrically written, but the writing is totally competent. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just more straightforward than, flowery and lyrical. And I feel like after reading The Spear Cuts Through Water, it's kind of a nice break to have something that's just very straightforward, takes no extra thought to process and follow. And the world building and the names of things and the magic system is complicated enough that it's kind of nice that the language itself is more simple, because there is kind of a lot to follow with the world and the magic and everything that's happening in the plot so far. So it's feeling like a nice break for my brain. I like the main character as well. I find him interesting, compelling. He is a bit young. He's 17. This doesn't necessarily read like YA to me, even though the main character is 17. It does feel maybe like a new adult, sort of straddling the line between adult and young adult, but I like the main character. I think he's interesting. He has a fascinating backstory. He is a little overpowered, but again, that's pretty common in fantasy for the main character to be exceptionally good at either a few specific things or literally everything. In this case, he's exceptionally good at pretty much everything without trying too hard, which is a bit irksome. Some of his backstory explains it, but some of it doesn't really, especially when it comes to his physical strength and physical prowess. it feels a little excessive, especially for a 17-year-old who is described as being not overly big or bulky or strong. His ability to take down these huge, really well-trained, really powerful opponents feels a little hard to believe, but I do like him as a character. I will say there have been maybe 2 moments that were a bit sexist that I didn't love coming from the main character, and that might be explained by the society seeming to be more patriarchal, and there are some laws, mainly birthright, that seem to imply that women have no control over their reproductive rights, that they are sort of required to reproduce as much as possible, and that they don't have a choice in the matter. So there might be an explanation for that, but I feel like we haven't really been given enough evidence for this society being particularly misogynistic for me to let go of the few moments that the main character specifically has been sexist. So that's irking me a little bit. It has been only, like I said, maybe twice, and they were not super egregious examples of misogyny, but they still, raised my hackles a little bit, and I wondered why that was necessary, especially because he's at this school now for kids of wealthy and powerful people within their society. And while there are more boys than girls, there are still a number of girls, and girls in some of the highest, most advanced classes. So clearly women are allowed to be in the school. There are female professors as well. So it feels a little odd to me and unnecessary. Those are my main criticisms so far, or the only things I've really noticed that have given me pause. Otherwise though, I'm really liking this. It's, like I said, very well paced. It's pretty quickly moving along. A lot has happened already. There have been quite a few interactions with a bunch of different combinations of characters so far that have been really sweet or charming or heartwarming, to the point that I assigned a color tab for those moments so that I could kind of track them throughout. I like that even the characters so far who are meant to be more antagonistic or maybe even villains of the story have a lot of layers and often are charismatic or have a point where you can be sympathetic and sort of understand their perspective. And especially the character who so far seems to be the best potential for our sort of final boss antagonist, at least as far as we know so far in the first half. They are incredibly charming and actually very likable. And so it's interesting because not only do I feel as a reader that I feel conflicted about the character because I can't help but like them, even though I have a feeling that they're actually a very bad person that I shouldn't like, but the main character is feeling that way too. And he has even more reasons to be skeptical and also to hate this person, but he's also struggling with it because this character has so much charisma and is so likable and affable. So I like that. I like the nuance of that. The world building is really interesting. It seems to be based on sort of a Roman Empire kind of structure. And the magic system is really cool too. They call their sort of magic their will. It's sort of their life force or their natural power. Their society is structured that the vast majority of people are octavi on the bottom rungs, and they sort of cede their will to people who are higher up in the hierarchy to use their life force, essentially, to use their power to do their own magic. And that pyramid keeps moving up and up and up. And the higher you go, it's exponential how much power you have access to each level that you move up. And the school that he is at is training them to use will and to become proficient in the use of will so that they can get high up positions within the hierarchy in those 3 main areas of governing. And our main character has been adopted by someone who is very high up in the military who wants him to infiltrate this school and figure out something that he's been trying to untangle, a mystery. He is suspicious of what's happening at the school that is run by the religion part of the society. So he wants someone on the inside, and he doesn't have any of his own kids, so he adopts our main character. The magic system is really interesting so far. I think this pyramid hierarchy system is fascinating. And so far we don't have a lot of detail about the actual mechanics of will, but I imagine as the main character learns more and becomes more proficient themselves, we'll sort of learn through his perspective as he learns how to use it. The themes seem to be sort of orbiting around the idea of a tyrannical government, the idea of colonization and oppression and inequality in society, and the few at the top siphoning resources from the many at the bottom and keeping people down artificially to be able to use them for their own benefit. And just the fact that this society really conquered the entire planet, or at least the entire continent, and has subjugated people and murdered people to force them to live within their rules. And our main character is from one of those lands that was conquered, and he has, his own reasons for being very against this society and not wanting to be a part of it. And so he's this outsider, fish out of water, now in this school with all these really, well-off children of the most powerful people in the society that he hates for a variety of reasons. So really intriguing, really fast-paced, like I said, pretty straightforward writing, but I do find, as much as it's not on the lyrical side, it is quite evocative. I feel like Islington is taking the time to describe where we are and what we're looking at and the different technologies that are popping up or the uses of magic enough that you can really envision what everything looks like and what the society is like. I like that sense of place. That's something that I feel like has come up multiple times in this video, because especially for fantasy, when the world is not just our own, it's really important to me to understand what everything looks like and how it feels to get that atmosphere. And I feel like as much as the writing itself is not maybe as lyrical or atmospheric, it is still evocative enough that I can really envision what the school is like, or what the island is like, or what the big city is like, or what the estate was like. I can really picture it in my mind based on the descriptions. So I appreciate that, because I always find it frustrating, especially in fantasy, but really in any book, when the setting is underdescribed, because then it just feels like the story is floating in a bubble in sort of a nebulous, ill-defined space. And for whatever reason, it's a lot harder for my brain to kind of latch onto it and to really immerse myself into it when I can't as clearly imagine where they are and what everything looks like. I'm excited to finish it and see where everything goes. This video is probably going to be very long as it is, so I think I'm going to leave it there, and I'll be back when I get to the end and I'll share my final thoughts on The Will of the Many. Hello, it's 1:45 in the morning and I just finished The Will of the Many, and I thought I would talk about it now while it's still all fresh in my mind instead of waiting till tomorrow, because damn, that ending really, wow, did not see it coming. I mean, part of the ending I saw coming, but the epilogue portion did not see coming. That was awesome and shocking, and wow, this was really good. It is not a perfect book. I have several criticisms, several points of contention or constructive criticism, feedback, but it was very good. I very much enjoyed reading it, and I will be reading the next in the series. So just getting that out there off the bat. But I'll try to share as much as I can without spoilers, and then I will do a spoiler section to talk about things in more detail. But basically all my criticisms from the first half still apply. Things like the magic system being a little bit ill-defined continued to be true. We didn't really get any more clarification about how will works and how they actually use will and what the limits to what will can do are. Just, it's all very nebulous. I needed a little bit more. It was very vague. And it's a pretty long book, 600 pages, and, you know, about a character in many ways training to be able to use will. So the fact that we didn't really ever learn how will works felt like a bit of a glaring omission. Also, Vis, our protagonist, is 100% a Gary Stu. He's good at literally everything. And I get that main characters have to be able to do stuff usually. They have to be good at something because they have to carry the story. But it does annoy me when they're good at literally everything they try. And Vis is good at literally everything, whether it's stuff that he has been doing over the last several years, or it's something he's never tried before, or it's something that he's only had 2 months of training in, or it's something that he apparently learned once when he was 12, but he's still really good at it now. Like, it's just, he's great at everything. It always feels like he's just waiting for his moment to prove to everyone that he is in fact smarter and stronger and faster and better than literally everyone else. And it is a little bit boring, you know? I want a character that really has to overcome something, and this character never felt like he had to overcome anything, and it just feels a little bit unrealistic, considering the further context in this story that he would be the best at literally all of these things all the time. I also felt like he didn't have the most vibrant personality. I'm not sure how I would describe his personality other than being smug and very self-confident and pretty righteous in his anger. He could have used a little bit more nuance, a little more depth to his characterization. It also didn't always make sense for him to be 17. I feel like this character and the skills he's supposed to have would make more sense if he was in his mid-20s at the very least, if not older. I think it would have added a lot of depth to him. It would have given more context for everything he'd been through. It would have made more sense for him to develop all these skills over more years. The idea that most of his incredible intelligence and knowledge and skills were developed before his land was taken over by the hierarchy, which happened when he was 14, is a little hard to believe. Maybe he's meant to be sort of a self-insert for the reader, therefore more of a blank slate, but I personally don't self-insert when I read books. I want to read about a character and feel like that is a real person with all the flaws and foibles and dynamics of a real person, and he felt a little bland while also being the best at everything, which, you know, it's not the most engaging characterization, I would say. That being said, all the other characters basically had way more nuance and were way more interesting, maybe because they were allowed to have flaws in a way that our main character wasn't, but pretty much every other character was more interesting. And I think that was one of the main strengths of this book, was how strong the characters were and their relationships. My favorite part of this book were the character interactions. They were just so great. There were so many wholesome, funny, sweet, endearing, silly moments between characters. There was so much growth in the relationships and in various characters. We got to watch characters go from being more antagonistic to developing some sort of a working relationship. A lot of the characters were very charming and likable. So I think the characterization was a really strong suit for this book, which was what makes it kind of more sad that the main character was a little bit everything and nothing all at once. Also, like I said in the first update, this reads like YA to me. Definitely older YA, but YA. The main character is 17, and the structure of the book, the writing style, everything about it felt YA, which isn't a bad thing. It's just a thing. It can be a bit frustrating sometimes to read about teenagers doing teenager things when you are not a teenager, and that's why I typically don't seek out YA. This would have been a better book for me if the main character was allowed to be in his mid-20s. Maybe that would make less sense for the school setting. Could have been more like a graduate school program instead of a late high school into early college type age. I think it still would have made sense, and I think it would have added more depth to all the characters, but especially to our main character. That being said, the YA writing style really did lend it that very compulsively readable, super well paced, very quick moving. It's a long book, but a lot happens. It's really packed full, very easy to read, very quick read considering it's 600 pages long. And it has pretty complex world building, a complicated political system, and there are a lot of different characters and a lot of rules to kind of be aware of. So I think that the writing style helped make that feel more approachable and more digestible as a reader. I will say that the last third or so was just so ridiculously immersive, really well paced. It was like reveal after reveal after reveal after exciting moment after shocking moment after violent, creepy, gross moment after reveal after reveal. It was a lot in a great way. I was so engaged and reading so fast and just loving it. So that was really awesome to have that. I love that feeling of just flipping the pages so fast and you're so immersed and you just can't do anything else. My husband wanted to go to bed about an hour ago and came down to say goodnight, and I was just sitting here flipping the pages and was like, yeah, good night, I love you. I'll be in bed soon, because I just couldn't tear myself away. And I love that feeling. That's one of my favorite things about reading, is when you get into that state of just full hyper focus. And this book gave me that for sure. I will say, not as bad as a lot of books I've read, but this book does do the thing that I hate when books do, which is leave too many threads completely tangled and loose at the end of the first book, knowing that there's going to be another book after it. On the one hand, I can understand that you don't want to tie everything up and then have to start fresh in the next book, but I did feel like there were a few too many things that were left open-ended at the end of this book, and that is just, you know, a personal preference of mine, that I like each book to feel self-contained enough that I can enjoy it. I want to feel like the first book has a satisfying ending, and to be excited to read the next book because the first book was so good, and because there are a couple little lingering things, not because there are so many loose threads that I feel like I didn't even finish a book. Like, I read a whole book and then there was no conclusion and you just feel like you're left hanging. I have a feeling that this doesn't bother other people quite as much as it bothers me, based on the fact that I feel like I never hear people talk about this really, but it bugs me a lot. So don't love that. Even though the ending was great in so many ways, that definitely bugged me. The final thing that really stands out to me is that as much as the themes are interesting to me, I did feel like they were lacking a bit of nuance, which also kind of, I guess, contributes to this feeling that it had a very YA feeling. It tried to tackle some really heavy topics and some really complicated topics of colonization and oppression and systems of oppression and the needs of the few outweighing the needs of the many, or the exploitation of the many to serve the needs of the few. There's just a lot going on there, and, you know, discussions of rebellion and who has a right to exist within a system. Is every level of person within a corrupt system complicit if they're not actively rebelling, or is there nuance to that? I just feel like the conversation itself, when it was had in a very black and white, very lacking in nuance way. And one of the things that really stood out to me most is this constant bringing back of the idea of birthright. It's never fully explained, but it seems from everything we learn about it throughout the book, and it comes up pretty often, that it is essentially a pro-life stance, not just in terms of pro-birth, although I think that can be implied. It was never stated outright, but it seems to fit within everything else we know about the system. And there were mentions here and there of birthright having to do with child rearing and marriages and how that is legislated, but it never goes into detail. But it definitely applies to it being against the law to kill anyone, the only exception being convicted criminals, but even they are not really meant to be killed outright, sort of other implications of what birthright means. But this concept comes up so many times, and it clearly impacts women to a further degree than men, because it does seem to tie in with reproductive rights and bodily autonomy, but it's never fully explored. It does seem like it's a patriarchal system. It does seem like men hold all of the most powerful positions in society, and yet none of the female characters in this book, we have professors, we have his adopted mother or the wife of the man who adopted him, friends of his that he makes who are girls, and none of them ever bring it up, and it never is brought into the conversation. They're all in this really competitive academic setting trying to get these really high-ranking positions, and yet we have heard of no women in any of these high-ranking positions, even though at the start of this book there are 2 girls in the top class, which just begs the question, is this the first time ever that women are in this top class? If so, why is no one talking about this? If this is common, why have we not heard of any other women in positions of power within the society? Are there many women in positions of power and we're just not hearing about them? I don't know, because the author didn't explore it, but it does feel like a glaring omission to create this out of thin air, out of your brain, and to bring it up so often and have the main character comment on it so often. I kept waiting for the author to address it, and then it just kept not happening. I think instead of bringing up birthright for the 14th time and just having a quip about how hypocritical it is, we could have had a female character talking about how it impacts her and her future. So yeah, those are all my criticisms. I feel like because I just listed all my criticisms back to back that makes it sound like I really didn't like this book. That's not the case. I did really enjoy this. I thought this was really well done. I will be reading the next book in the series, and I did really enjoy my time with this book, but that doesn't mean it's perfect. And as you probably know, if you've made it this far in this video, and also if you've watched any videos on my channel, I think that there's value in being critical of the books we read, even the books we really, really like or even love. I think critical reading is a really important skill. I think it's a skill that we should all be cultivating in ourselves. I think you can love a book and still have feedback and constructive criticism, and it's okay to recognize flaws or missed opportunities in books that we enjoy while still enjoying them. And so that's how I feel about this. And I am sitting pretty solidly right now at 4 stars. I think for a lot of people, this is going to be a fast, easy, fun, interesting, engaging read, even if it is not the most nuanced or perfect read with the most well-developed main character ever. So those are my non-spoilery thoughts. I do want to move over to spoilers because I do have a couple things to say. Let's move over to spoilers. This is going to be spoilers for this entire book, the whole thing. So skip this if you want to read this book. Seriously though, basically the ending was awesome. I'm not going to talk through the whole ending. The twist at the end and the fact that he's basically existing in 2 places at once was very cool and shocking. I did not see that coming, and I loved that the book ended that way. It was very intriguing. Definitely made me want to read the next book in the series. But I did not appreciate that Calidus died. It felt so unnecessary. I cried because the scene between them was so beautiful, and him carrying him and realizing he died and just continuing to carry him because he couldn't deal with it or process that his friend was dead was heartbreaking. Once the book was over and I thought about it for 2 seconds, I got annoyed because why? Why did he have to die? There was no reason. He could have lived. He could have been, maimed or something, but died? Really? Did he have to die? I don't think so. I felt like that was a bit unnecessary. It made me upset. And even the main character says, he's talking to his friend and he's really upset, and he says that Calidus's death was so meaningless. And his friend says, death is only meaningless if it does not change us. And on the one hand, I think that's beautiful, and I think that sentiment is really lovely, and I agree in many ways, but also sometimes death is meaningless, especially in fiction. I feel like there are characters that are killed off more for shock value or because that was the end of the arc and the author wanted to. Like, there are times where deaths don't mean as much, and it felt that way with his character, and it annoyed me because he was a great character. He had so much potential. Maybe there was meant to be some shock there of not only did a lot of characters die in the last 10% of this book, but they also wanted to kill off some characters we knew better to be more impactful, I guess, or to really show us the stakes. But it just felt too throwaway for me and too much focused on shock value. And yeah, I still overall think the ending is great. I thought it was really fast-paced and exciting and interesting, and I love the setup for a sequel of trying to figure out what is going on with his magic and being in 2 places at once, and what is going on with Fridius, because he seems to maybe not be as much of a villain as we once thought, but is he sending kids to their death? We don't know. It's another one of the threads that were left untied. And I mean, so many of those threads were things like, what's really happening with rebellion? Is his adopted mother actually one of the leaders of the rebellion, or is she lower down on the totem pole? What's going on with Misa, and why did she stab him? And how did she sense his tainted blood? And what does that mean? And why did they not get to talk at the end? And what is really going on with military? And does his adopted father know what military is doing? Or are they really in league with the rebels? Or was that one rebel just saying that to throw him off the scent and to stress him out? We don't know. There were so many threads left, and I think that's fine because it is the first book in a series, so I guess we will explore all those things. But there were just so many things left unsaid. That final chapter before that is like wrapping up the main storyline in the only reality we know to exist at that point felt really rushed. And I think adding a few more pages or maybe a second chapter to that resolution would have maybe tied things up a little bit better for me. And the book was already 600 pages. So, adding 5 more pages to give us a little bit more of a satisfying and comprehensive ending, a good conclusion to this first installment, I think wouldn't have thrown anyone off. Like, if you're already going to read a 600 page book, you'll read a 605 page book, Oh, also, another loose thread. What is the deal with Diego, the gigantic wolf who was given one singular fish by her main character and helped out of being his paw was trapped in the river or something? I don't remember. This one interaction leads him to risk his life to save our main character multiple times. Like, is he a hyper intelligent wolf? Are the wolves magical? Do they have some sort of deep connection? We don't know. There's no explanation. He just shows up at the most opportune moments to take down the enemies and risk everything to save him multiple times, pull him out of the water at the end so he doesn't drown. It just feels a little convenient, you know? Nothing about this wolf. No, we're just going to accept that it's always there at the right time to save his life. Okay, that's it for spoilers. I'm done. Spoilers finished. 4 stars for The Will of the Many. Great read. Would highly recommend, you know, with the caveat of what I already said, you know, all my criticisms, if those are things that are really going to bug you, this probably won't be for you. But I think a lot of people are really going to love this book, and I really, really enjoyed it. So we only have one final chance to get a 5-star reading this video, and that is Blood Over Brighthaven. I'm putting a lot of hopes and dreams on this book right here because I thought for sure I would get a 5-star read in this video. I honestly thought I would get multiple. Maybe that's too much pressure to put on this book. But like I said, this is the one that I saw the most raving, over-the-top, amazing reviews for, and people loving it, and it becoming their new favorite of all time, above any other fantasy book they'd ever read. So while that is definitely raising the hype levels, it's also raising my hopes that maybe the book will live up to the hype. I certainly hope so. All right, so I just hit the halfway point of Blood Over Brighthaven, and damn, I am really struggling to pause reading to make this update because I really want to keep reading and find out what happens. This is very good so far. I'm going to try to keep this really brief because I have a feeling I'm going to finish this very quickly and then I'll be back to share all my thoughts, and I'll probably have a lot to say. So I'm going to try to do like speed round mid-book update. Basically in this book, we have 2 protagonists. One is Tomil, who is from outside the city, and the first chapter follows he and his family attempting to cross this dangerous area to make it to the safety of the city. And he is a Quen, which is a group of people from, again, outside the city who are treated very poorly. They are the lowest class of society. They are given the worst jobs, the most dangerous jobs. Their lives don't hold as much value, and the people born within the city are incredibly racist toward them and, you know, think terribly of them, think they're these heathens who are so uncivilized and need this great city's help to survive their land that turned against them for worshiping the wrong god and all the bullshit. And he is working as a janitor within this academy for mages, and he happens to meet the first female high mage in history, our other protagonist, Siona, on her first day at work, and helps her find her lab. And thanks to a double whammy of a racist and misogynistic joke at their expense from her coworkers, he becomes her assistant. And so as the book progresses, we learn more about both Tomil and Siona, whose parents were both born within the city. She is pure Tyrannish stock, but her mother was of the lower classes and her father was upper class. And when her mother passed away, her father abandoned her basically, and she went to live with her mother's sister, her aunt, in a poorer area of the city. And she really had to work her way up. She was transferred on scholarship from a public school to a private school because she had so much talent. She was so smart, she worked so hard, and she has worked her way up through to a master's degree in various aspects of magic, and she becomes the first female high mage in history in the city. And she is an interesting character because she is very resentful of the misogyny that she has to face. She hates being treated differently for being a woman. She hates how much harder she has to work to get the same acclaim and opportunities that mediocre men get. She also has experienced a little bit of the, nepotism within the system, and the fact that while her father is actually upper class and actually is a politician, because they're not associated with each other, she doesn't get to use his name for any kind of an advancement. And even if he was, she probably couldn't use it because she's a woman in this deeply misogynistic society. I really can't reinforce enough how misogynistic this city is. It's wild, to the point of lobotomizing women who are hysterical to make them more docile housewives. Like, it's rough out here. She hates the classism and misogyny when it's directed at her, but she is very much a product of the society. And so she also sends out quite a bit of her own classism and misogyny, in addition to racism, which comes up a lot when she's dealing with Tamil, especially at the beginning of the book. She believes everything she's ever been fed about the Quen. She believes that women are generally more hysterical and less intelligent and less capable than men, but she is sort of an outlier. She has very classist beliefs despite growing up in a lower income neighborhood. She has a lot to unpack. And for that reason, she's a very difficult protagonist to like, at least for me. I very much struggled through the first 40% or so of the book with her as a character, because she says and does some absolutely despicable things. Like, whatever you're imagining, it's probably worse. She is pretty terrible, and she's very self-righteous. She sees herself as a God-fearing woman, and she really believes in this religion of the city, and the religion is very pompous and holier than thou, and she really takes on those traits. She's very prideful, selfish, egotistical, power-hungry, all things that she freely admits. She really doesn't care about people she doesn't think are important. She repeatedly forgets people's names and then later says, if only they were interesting enough for me to care. Like, she just does not give a shit. She's kind of terrible. So she's the other protagonist we're following, and we're watching her and Tamil try to develop a working relationship, and she teaches Tamil all the basics of how they use technology and magic to run this city, sort of her area of study, and through teaching him, they're also teaching us, the reader, how the magic system works and how the technology works. And in some ways that feels a little bit info dumpy at times. There are times that I wished we could have learned some of this stuff in a little bit more of an organic way. The fact that she is giving, Magic 101 to her new assistant who knows nothing about magic, conveniently, so that we, the reader, can also learn Magic 101. It's a little contrived, but I do find the magic system really interesting, and the blending of magic and technology is very interesting. There is a big reveal about a third of the way through the book that challenges her worldview on a pretty profound level. And that sort of seems to be the inciting incident for her maybe doing some soul searching. There hasn't been enough time since that reveal yet for me to really know what direction she's going to go. But I'm hoping that she is going to grow and change and become a better person, because it's been rough following her for the first part of the book. But she has learned something that she can't unlearn that changes her perspective. And that is really going to be the driving force, I think, for the rest of the novel and what direction she is going to take. She is basically in a competition with her coworkers to present the perfect magic formula for an expansion of their city. They basically want to make the magical bubble that keeps them safe within the city from the winter and the blight a little bit bigger so that they can accommodate population growth. She and Tamil are working on that. They have a deadline. She's training him. They are learning more about each other. He's teaching her about the Quen, and she's realizing that a lot of her perspectives about them are not necessarily completely accurate, and the Quen are not as simple and violent and primitive as her society has told her. For more context, I guess, the reason why they need this magical barrier, like I said, is to protect them from the winter and the blight. And the blight is this sort of mysterious illness or disease that afflicts all the areas outside the city, all the areas not protected by this magical dome. And within the city, they contextualize the blight as, all the people outside the city are heathens. They don't accept the god of the city, and so therefore they deserve to be smited by God, basically, is how they see it. And Tamil at the beginning, had to cross this really dangerous area, the remaining people in his tribe, in an attempt to make it to safety because their food sources, their crops, the animals that they hunted were all being killed off by blight to the point where they wouldn't be able to survive the winter. And so they risked this really dangerous area to try to get to the city. And that's that first chapter, which was so harrowing and intense. I cried in the very first chapter of this book about what was happening to the characters. I was so worried about them already, which was just incredible. It was such a heart-wrenching, intense, powerful way to start a book and immediately drew me in and made me care so deeply about Tamil right off the bat. This is a really important mission that they're working toward because, like I said, the city has this ever-increasing population. There's not enough space for all of them within the dome, but there's no other safe place for them to go. So they really need to expand. This is of vital importance. And so they have this really strong motivation to develop a great working relationship, but also to make these great leaps of innovation with magic to pull this together. And like I said, the magic system is really interesting. I love the blending of magic and technology. They use these typewriters essentially to execute their magic almost like code. I know very little about code, but that's how it reads to me. And they pull all the energy, they siphon energy from this other realm to allow them to power all the technology and magic of their society. And our other protagonist, Siona, specifically focused in her studies on mapping and being able to manually select coordinates within the other realm to draw exactly the amount of energy needed to execute a particular command, to do a particular type of magic. And that's what they're really working hard on for this project, is being able to figure out what coordinates they can use, how they can draw enough energy to do this without drawing too much energy, which could be dangerous. So there's a lot of things to take into account. And really interesting magic and technology blended together. The world building's pretty good. I could use a little bit more descriptive language, sense of place for the city itself. We've gotten a little bit, but not a huge amount. There have been some little things here and there that indicate, maybe they're really far north, near the poles. It seems like they only get 2 hours of daylight at this time of year, and it might even reduce to the point where they have no daylight for a certain period of time. So it seems like they are quite far north, if it were our world, near or in the Arctic Circle. But we really don't get that much development of the world, and maybe that is intentional. Maybe it's because for the most part we've been closely following Siona, and there are definitely things that her society are not interested in the average person, even the average high mage, knowing about. It seems like there are a lot of secrets, and their society is very controlled by their religion. And so there are things that the religious leaders and the founders and the archmages want to keep to themselves for the same reasons why all powerful people in every society ever, fictional or real, love to keep information to themselves. It's a great way to control the populace. So I would love a little bit more of that. I like the writing style. It's not overtly lyrical or flowery by any means, but it's very efficient. It's very nice to read. There are a couple really powerful, emotional, resonant moments in the writing, but nothing is too poetic. What else can I say? The characters, like I said, are very interesting. They're very flawed and complex. Siona is infuriating and kind of terrible, but she is interesting. And Tamil is also very flawed and complex and not a perfect person. He's much more likable though, and much easier to root for. I do wish we were getting a bit more of his perspective, though it does feel like we're starting to, so I'm hoping that that continues. And then the last thing that I'll touch on in this update is the thematic content so far. This is exploring similar concepts to the other books that I've read in this video: corruption in government, misuse of power, wealth inequality, unequal distribution of resources, mistreatment of people on the bottom of the social hierarchy, racism and misogyny and colonization and the sort of destruction of native cultures, forced assimilation, religious bigotry or persecution, kind of all these things tied together, which I think are very common themes to be explored in fantasy. I feel like they come up quite often. I will do a super short spoiler section because I want to talk about that big reveal that happened, because I kind of guessed it. I didn't guess it perfectly. I didn't figure out all the little intricate details, but I did sort of see it coming, so I'm feeling proud of myself and I have to brag a little bit. But I also want to talk about that reveal because it's kind of wild, but it also deepens the themes. But I can't talk about it in a non-spoiler way. It just ruins it. And if you're going to read this, please don't watch the spoiler section. It will ruin that first reveal for you. And I think that it's important. I think learning that as the characters do is really impactful. So please don't watch the spoilers if you're going to read it, okay? Even if you don't think you care about spoilers, this is a big one. So skip it. Yes, you skip it. So spoilers now. Use the chapters to skip these if you're going to read this book. Spoilers for the first half of Blood Over Brighthaven are starting now. Have you skipped it? Okay, good. When the Blight was introduced in that first chapter, and they talked about going to the city to save themselves, and we started hearing a little bit about how the magic works, I immediately thought, okay, the Blight is 100% a side effect of or caused by this city and by the magic that they're using. For sure, 100%, I know it. And as I started to learn more things and as they start to get little hints here and there, every single new fact we learned, I was like, yes, this reinforces my theory. I know for sure that the Blight is caused by this magic. And then as we started to learn about the other realm and the mapping, I was like, okay, the other realm, like where they pull energy from, has to be outside of the city. And the Blight has to be connected to this, like they're pulling energy, they're siphoning life force basically. And all of that was right. I was correct. The Blight is caused by the magic, or the magic is the Blight essentially. And the area that they're pulling from, the other realm, is just outside the city. And when they siphon energy, they're either siphoning the life force out of a tree or wheat fields or a horse or people. And they die in a horrific way where their bodies basically unraveled in incredibly gruesome ways, and then their life force is used as energy within the city. So I was right about that. What I got wrong, though, was that I thought they kept talking about these forbidden coordinates, and my theory was that the forbidden coordinates were like some area with a huge amount of life, a huge amount of stored power for whatever reason, like whether that was where a lot of the Quen lived or, you know, a very vibrant valley, I don't know. And for whatever reason that area was more powerful, more potent, and that they kept it off limits because they wanted that to be saved for the archmages, that only they could use this extremely potent magic, and they were sort of saving it for themselves. And they kept saying, you know, siphoning magic from this area is evil, it's of the devil, because they really didn't want anyone else to get their hands on that power. Turns out, I probably should have seen this coming, especially because she said it was a circle at the center, but it's literally just the city. The circle at the center that is the city is those forbidden coordinates because they don't want them to siphon people within the city of their life force and energy. And the one mage that was ever put to death for treason, who went around on a murdering rampage, actually just siphoned energy from within the forbidden coordinates and used it to try to kill his fellow coworkers. Because he was not very accurate, he ended up killing their whole families and households and servants and other people in the neighborhood. And they were found in these bloody messes, like they were murdered brutally, but actually they were just siphoned and unraveled in the ways that the people outside of the city are. And the periphery of the city, which is that really dangerous crossing point between the rest of, you know, the plains and the mountains and all the other areas of the world and the city, is the area that is constantly pulled from. It is seen as the reserve, and that is where they pull energy for all the basic processes of the city. All their basic technology comes from there, and they are constantly siphoning from it, which is what makes it so incredibly dangerous to cross, because it is always searching for life to pull from. The assumption is that someone knows that they are sacrificing any people who try to escape the ravages of the Blight and make it to the city. Most of them are going to be sacrificing their lives to keep the city going and die a horrific death, which is what happened to every single one of Tamil's tribe members, all of his family members, with the exception of himself and his niece, when he first came to the city in the first chapter. I'm so annoyed at myself for not guessing that, because it makes a lot of sense, although I also think it makes sense for it to be some, you know, super powerful force that they're keeping for themselves, because that also tracks for the city. The other thing I guessed was that the magic initially came from the land that was colonized and from the people who lived there. The Quen were the ones to do the magic originally, and it was stolen, which was also proved to be correct. It was given to them by God, but actually they just took it from the native peoples and then sacrificed the native people to fuel their energy. But when Siona uses the information that Tamil tells her and research that she does to alter the mapping system so she can see in it like a mirror, which is what the Quen sorceresses would do, where she could really see a picture instead of just a black and white map of coordinates. She was able to do a test and watched a young girl start to disintegrate horribly, and she was able to stop the spell before she was completely used up, but she had been injured enough, disintegrated enough that there was no way she would survive. And Siona loses it. Like, she breaks down, she's hysterically sobbing, she is so distraught. And as hard as it is to read, and as much as Siona was such a unlikable character, I feel like the way that that was portrayed was so visceral. I couldn't help but feel bad for her because she was in so much pain. Everything that she thought she knew about how her society works, everything she had dedicated her whole life to, has just been twisted into this disgusting, horrifying, horrific thing. And even though she has turned a blind eye to horrific things every day of her life within the city, it's like this is the final piece of the puzzle that makes her have to open her eyes to what's happening. And the violent cognitive dissonance that she feels and that desperate need to cling to denial because she can't let go of her entire worldview is devastating to read. She can't live in her society without participating in magic. Literally everything is fueled by this siphoned energy that comes from living beings. So how does she realizes she can't even get home because she has to take the train and it is powered by this siphoned energy. How does she reconcile that? And then what does she do? Because she's dedicated her whole life to learning magic and wielding it. And every time she does a spell, she's siphoning life force. And she doesn't know how many times she has siphoned the life of a person, and she's horrified. So I thought that that was really well done. It was really impactful, and I really, really hope that that is the start. It seems like it is the start of her transformation as a character and her growth, and that she will become a little bit less of a little shit because she was really pissing me off. I think it is. I think that has altered her brain chemistry on a fundamental level, and she can't go on the way she was before. There also is implication and tension building that Siona and Tamil are falling in love. I don't love that, to be honest, especially because she's just been unendingly racist to him since they met and really condescending and literally slapped him at one point and told him that his people deserved to die horrible deaths and that was their fault. So, not super rooting for a romance, but maybe if she really grows as a person, I'll change my mind. I think that's it for spoilers so far. I'm really liking this. I'm very engaged and intrigued. Struggling with Siona as a character, but the book is really fascinated and very well paced. So I'm excited to go finish this. I don't think it's going to take me too long. And when I'm done, I'll be back for my final review and then we can wrap up this whole video. Cross your fingers and toes for me that this is going to be a 5-star read because I'd love to finish this video on a high note. I just finished Blood Over Brighthaven and I'm a bit of a mess, if you couldn't tell already. That ending broke me a little bit. It was beautiful, but very sad. Okay, talking about the book. Probably pretty obvious that I really liked it. It really moved me. This is not a perfect book, okay? It's not It's not a perfect book. I still have many criticisms of it. Fewer criticisms than I did after the first half because some things did sort of resolve for me, or at least move in the right direction. Yeah, not totally 100% perfect best fantasy I've ever read, but very, very good. And I think I probably have to give it 5 stars. Which, thank goodness, because I was starting to feel like this whole video was a failure. No, it's not a failure. I read many books that I really enjoyed in this video, but to say that it was really, 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 really good, and it made me feel all the feelings, and I'm going to remember this very fondly. Whew. Okay, Sayana is definitely a very complex, nuanced, layered, flawed, morally gray, incredibly gray character. She's a bit of an egomaniac. She's very glory and power hungry and selfish and self-centered and definitely needed a lot of working through her internalized misogyny and also the racism that she was raised in and classism. She does not end the book as a perfect paragon of virtue, but she does come a long way in her character development to the point where I felt like I could root for her a lot more. Still not a perfect character or a perfect person, but perfect people are boring to read books about, and I prefer when characters have more nuance than that. And so I appreciate her nuance. Still not sure if I like her, but she was interesting, and she did have quite the character arc, quite the journey throughout the book. Tamil, also very flawed, very complex character, not nearly as morally gray as Sayana, way more likable overall and continued to be. Some of the themes, things like colonization and oppression, forced assimilation, forced labor, unsafe labor practices, wealth inequality, racism, misogyny, all kinds of topics that came up. In the first half, I did feel like quite a few of the topics were being talked about in a pretty simplistic, lacking in nuance manner, and while I agreed with the message and thought the themes were interesting, I was a bit frustrated by the way they were being explored. But I did feel as the book went on and as the characters developed their understanding of the world and each other and these ideas more and more, the conversations they were having about the themes deepened and became more nuanced. And there were even moments where characters sort of came back to a discussion and acknowledged that their opinion was too simplistic previously, and they'd sort of thought about it more and realized that there was more nuance, because real life is nuanced. Real life is not simplistic in any way. I appreciated that, and that really was something that I thought might bring the rating down in the first half, but I really enjoyed how things deepened and became more complex as the book went on and as the characters figured themselves out more. I guess I can't talk about this without it being a spoiler. I was about to jump into it, but it's definitely a spoiler. I'll talk about it in the spoiler section, but one of the main themes is sort of an ethical dilemma that I found really interesting and could sort of relate to from my own lived experience, and I thought the way that it was portrayed was very accurate, as difficult as it was to read. I think it was a great representation of that feeling. So I will talk about that in the spoiler section. Yeah, this was really well paced, fast paced. I think I said in the first update that I was worried this would be too short. Maybe slightly. I feel like another 50 pages could have helped give things a little bit more space and fleshed out a couple little things here or there. But honestly, this was pretty well paced. This was pretty snappy and punchy, and as much as I'm kind of, I can't believe I'm saying this because I was so excited that this was a standalone. I'm kind of sad that this is a standalone because I would love more of this world and these characters. I also think concludes the themes and the messages of this book so much more profoundly. It hits so much harder knowing that it's the end, and there's that finality to it that really drives home the message in a way that I think is very effective. I am really impressed that M.L. Wang was able to do so much with a relatively short book in the realm of fantasy right now, just over 400 pages. It was really a complete arc with a lot of complex themes and some great character development, and maybe not as in-depth or complicated world building as I've ever read, but certainly enough to be a vehicle for the themes and the story. A lot of plot, a lot of intricate magic system and technology development, some really gut-wrenching emotional moments. I cried in the first chapter and in the last chapter. and got teary-eyed a few times in between. So yeah, wow. I've never read from M.L. Wang before, but I will definitely read more of their work. I think the ending was great, kind of bleak, but also great. And yeah, I don't think this is perfect. I still have some criticisms of it, but I think I have to give it 5 stars. It was pretty fantastic. And now I'm going to talk about spoilers because I feel like there's so much that I can't say right now because it really would give away so much. I mean, the fact that there was a reveal maybe a third of the way through the book, and after that, almost anything that happens is a spoiler. So it's kind of hard to talk about this book without spoiling it. So spoiler section incoming. Do not watch this spoiler section if you want to read this book. I'm telling you, it will ruin it for you. Don't watch it. Let me know if you read this book. Did you feel like the end felt like a white savior situation? Because really this book is so much about forced assimilation and colonization and genocide and stealing people's land and magic and lives to build a civilized society on their bones, essentially. It is all about that. And yet the hero of the story, the one who sacrifices her own life to try to save the Quen, is the egomaniac, power-hungry white lady. Siona grows a lot throughout the book, okay? But she is admittedly part of the problem. It does rub me a little bit the wrong way that it is her taking it down. Now, who else could have taken it down? I don't know. Probably Tamil didn't learn enough about magic at this point to take it down himself. He also didn't have the same access she had. So does it make sense on a logical level? Yes. I don't know how to feel because it doesn't feel like it's intentionally doing that. It doesn't feel like it's trying to say that the Quen needed to be saved by her, but it's kind of doing that. You know, I do think the fact that she died helps a little bit because it's not like she saved them and then now she is taking over and she's going to be the new leader of the city and there's no consequences for everything she did. Like, she knew in doing this that she probably wouldn't make it out alive. And the fact that it was Tamil fulfilling her final wish that actually took her out, that killed her by the blight, you know, it feels like divine retribution or something. Like, she had to experience exactly what she did to who knows how many Quen throughout her career. And there's a little bit of that retribution and payment in kind. Maybe that makes it feel less like a white savior situation. The fact that she and Tamil, through executing the spell, was able to literally execute basically all the politicians and high mages in the city and take them all out in one fell swoop and sort of punish them all for years of massacring the Quen, and use that power to expand the boundary, to make the city bigger, to potentially hold more people, protect more people, and also to temporarily shut down the blight so many Quen can escape and try to live in their own lands again. There is something that feels very right about that ending, or like it's at least wiping the slate clean as much as possible to maybe build something better from the ashes. I'm glad that Tamil and Kara didn't die, at least as of the end of the book. Who knows if they'll survive, but that they have a chance. I'm glad that the evil high mage rapist was brutally murdered with a magical typewriter. That was pretty satisfying, not gonna lie. Or the theme that really stands out to me that I thought was really well represented is this idea of the blight takes life to give them luxury. It is horrific, painful death for anyone outside the city so that they can have electric light and trains. You know, all of their little daily luxuries and the functioning of their society is built on the pain, suffering, and death of everyone outside the border. And when Siona learns about this, she goes through, you know, all the stages of grief and the anger and the denial and the depression and the numbness, and that cognitive dissonance was so strong in her. And I kind of loved that at the end we saw a mirroring of her reaction in Alba, her cousin, who she expected to immediately feel for the Quen and immediately understand why she had to publicize this truth to everyone and oust the leaders for the murder. She thought that Alba would immediately understand and get it and have compassion for the Quen and realize they had to change the system. And instead, Alba is having exactly the same reaction she did. Anger, viciousness, denial, hatred. You know, she is so angry at Siona for forcing her to face the cost of her daily luxuries, the cost of her life, and she's not willing to let go of it. She's not willing to give up any of the comforts of her life, even if it means continuing to murder people outside of the city. And she even slaps Siona just like Siona slapped Tummel. I loved that. I loved that we got to see it again, because I do think it is such a realistic reaction to having your worldview shattered, and also the realization that everything that you have taken for granted is not coming to you for free, that there is a cost. Now that you know, that now that you've taken a bite out of the apple of knowledge, you can't claim ignorance, and now you have to live with that guilt, or you have to give up everything that you've come to rely on. And you don't want to, like the selfishness, the greed, the complacency. But I feel like I went through the 7 stages of grief when I came to the realization that I had to either go vegan or live against my values. Basically, I went through all those feelings. I was angry, I was in denial, I didn't want to give up cheese. I loved cheese so much. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I can't unlearn what I've learned, you know? And I cannot live with myself and choose eating pasta with Parmesan on it over the lives of cows when I've seen what happens to them. So I just feel like I could really relate to that. And not only that, of sort of the personal level, the rage and the fear and the discomfort and the denial and wanting to go back to before you knew the cost, but also the way it makes other people feel. Because I can tell you, after almost 15 years as a vegan, people are angry that I exist because it forces them to think about why vegans exist and the reasons why people go vegan. And even that is enough to make people feel that discomfort, the cognitive dissonance, the denial, the anger, the don't take away the things that I care about, don't make me look at the cost feelings. And it's normal, it's natural, it's a normal human reaction. That's how our brains work. Ideally, you work through the pain, you work through all those stages of grief like Siona did, and you come out the other side and you make the more ethical choice and you change your life, even if it's hard. That's what I chose to do. But it is very normal, and a lot of people choose instead to continue to live in denial or to try to forget. I really appreciated that representation, because as visceral as it is, as uncomfortable as it can be to read, I do think it's accurate, and I do think it is important to know that that is an aspect of change, especially when the change is so fundamental when it comes to our ways of life or our base values. At first, I absolutely hated the idea of Tummel and Siona having any kind of a romance, but with her huge character growth throughout, by the end I didn't mind it, and they didn't end up happily ever after. He ended up basically murdering her and escaping with his adopted daughter / niece, and you know, she's dead. So it's not like they get a happily ever after. They did kiss twice or 3 times when they said goodbye and could acknowledge that they fell in love. And I think that that was a fitting end. I don't know if they would have worked together long term. I don't know if they could have made it work, especially within that society. Even not knowing how it's going to sort of rebuild itself from the ashes, it might not have ever worked. But at least they had that fleeting love, and that love allowed them to tear down a corrupt, brutal, bloody system and hopefully allow something better to grow in its place. I think that's all I have to say for spoilers, so I'll wrap up the spoiler section. I did also just want to give this comparison. If you liked Babel, I think you'll like this book, and even if you didn't love Babel, I gave Babel 3 stars. I thought it was interesting, but didn't do everything I hoped for it to do, and was a little clumsy in its execution and a little lacking in subtlety in the themes. I think this book does what Babel was trying to do better. I got a 5-star read in this video. I'm so glad. I was really worried there for a minute. I guess I'll do a quick little wrap up before I go. So I'm going to rank all the books I read in this video. Blood Over Brighthaven's gonna be at the top because it's my only 5-star, but I did have 3 4-star reads in this video, so I feel like this is gonna be a little rough. So Blood Over Brighthaven's on top. When the Moon Hatched is on the bottom because it was my only 3-star read. And then what am I doing with these 3? I don't know. Once again, I reserve the right to change my mind. Blood Over Brighthaven was my favorite. Then The Spear Cuts Through Water, To Shape a Dragon's Breath, The Will of the Many, and When the Moon Hatched. These 3 middle ones are really neck and neck. This is very difficult to decide between them. It's a struggle, but I think that this is how I feel. Easy first and last, and a bit of a muddy middle. Oh, and for everyone's satisfaction, here is the side with the tabs. I got a little carried away, okay? I used a lot of tabs. in this video. So that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Give it a like if you did. This is probably a monster length video. I haven't finished editing it as of filming this final update, but I have an inkling of how long it's gonna be, so thanks for making it all the way through if you did. I might end up having to upload this in 2 parts, depending, but thank you for watching it. Like it if you enjoyed it. Leave a comment down below to help it in the algorithm since I put lots of work into this video. Let me know your thoughts on any of these books if you read any of them. Are you gonna pick any of these up after this video? Did you remove any of them from your TBR after this video? Do you have recommendations for me? Further recommendations based on this video? Let me know all those things in the comments. Subscribe if you haven't already. I will make more monster reading vlogs like this. Maybe not soon, but I will. Thank you again to Fable for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to click the link in my description box to download Fable for free and try it today. It's an amazing way to track your reading. It is so fun. I highly recommend. So thank you again to Fable for sponsoring this video. Thank you all for watching. Thank you for being here. I appreciate you all so much. And I'll see you really soon in my next one. Bye, friends.